There are records in the archives of the Ordo Xenos that very few Inquisitors have read in their entirety. Not because access is restricted, though access is always restricted to some degree when the Ordo is involved, but because the Inquisitors who begin reading them tend to stop at a certain point and request reassignment. Not because the contents are incomprehensible. The horror of the Tyranid dossiers is not that they describe something alien and unreadable. The horror is that they are entirely depressingly comprehensible. You understand what you are reading. You understand what it means. And that understanding is the thing that stops you. The first page of the comprehensive threat assessment, compiled over decades of desperate analysis by some of the finest minds the Ordo Xenos has ever produced, contains a single prefatory line. It was written by Inquisitor Cryptman, whose name you will come to know as this story develops, whose career was defined by the Tyranid threat in ways that ultimately consumed him as surely as any world the Hive Fleets devoured. The line reads, "We are not at war with the Tyranids. We are witnessing from inside the process what the galaxy looks like when it is being eaten." That line does not appear in any public record of the Imperium. It does not appear in the histories taught to young soldiers or the sermons delivered by the priests of the Imperial Creed or the operational briefings distributed to regimental commanders before they are deployed to contested worlds. It exists in one place, in the sealed archives of the Ordo Xenos, and the reason it has never been more widely distributed is not that the Ordo considers it inaccurate. It is that the Ordo considers it, accurately, to be the kind of truth that reduces fighting effectiveness in the soldiers who hear it. And in the war against the Tyranids, fighting effectiveness is, if not the most important thing, at least the most immediately measurable thing. Everything else is philosophy. This account is not concerned with fighting effectiveness. This account is concerned with the truth. And the truth of the Tyranid Hive Fleets is one of the most consequential and most terrible truths in the recorded history of a galaxy that has never been short of terrible truths. To understand why the Tyranids are different from every other threat the galaxy has ever produced, you first have to understand what the galaxy contained before they arrived. Not in the military sense, not in the strategic sense, though both of those contexts will matter before this story is finished. You need to understand what the galaxy had always assumed about the nature of threats, about the shape of the dangers that civilizations faced, and about what it meant for something to be an enemy. The Imperium of Man, in the 10,000 years since the Horus heresy left it crippled and suspicious and burning with the effort of its own continuation, had faced enemies of almost every conceivable variety. It had faced the Chaos Space Marines, those fallen warriors who had turned against the Emperor and retreated into the Eye of Terror to spend millennia nursing their resentments and planning their revenge. It had faced the Eldar, ancient and diminished and bitter, the remnants of a civilization that had destroyed itself and had never entirely forgiven the galaxy for continuing to exist while it declined. It had faced the Orcs, those vast, essentially unkillable enthusiasts of violence who spread through the galaxy with the irresistible momentum of a biological disaster, treating warfare less as a strategy and more as a lifestyle that occasionally produced territorial expansion as a side effect. It had faced the Tau, that young and optimistic species building their empire in the Eastern Fringe, with an efficiency and a collective purpose that the Imperium found simultaneously impressive and profoundly irritating. It had faced the Necrons, those ancient skeletal warriors awakening from their long sleep in tombs scattered across thousands of worlds, bringing with them technologies that predated human civilization by millions of years, and an attitude toward lesser races that ranged from contemptuous to actively homicidal. All of these enemies had one thing in common. They all wanted something. The Chaos Gods wanted worship and the destruction of order. The Eldar wanted survival and the continuation of whatever could be salvaged of their culture. The Orcs wanted violence and the particular joy that violence produced in beings engineered. The Tau wanted expansion and the incorporation of other species into their philosophy of collective purpose. The Necrons wanted the resurrection of their ancient empire, and depending on which Necron you encountered, anything from geological patience to immediate and indiscriminate slaughter. But they all wanted. They all had motivations that could, in principle, be understood and reasoned about and potentially negotiated with, or at least manipulated. They were all, in the deepest sense, comprehensible. The Tyranids want nothing. That is the first thing to understand. They do not want to conquer the galaxy or rule it or destroy it in the service of some larger ideological purpose. They have no ideology. They have no faith, no art, no philosophy, no concept of honor or glory or legacy. They are not cruel, because cruelty requires an appreciation of suffering, requires deriving something from the experience of inflicting it, and the Tyranids derive nothing from the suffering of what they consume. They are not malicious, because malice requires intent directed at a specific target for a specific reason, and the Tyranids have no specific reasons. They have only the consuming, which is not a choice but a nature as fundamental and as impersonal as gravity or entropy. They are, in the most precise possible sense, a hunger, an extragalactic hunger of a scale that the ordinary vocabulary of war and conflict and threat cannot adequately describe. And they are coming. They have been coming for longer than any civilization in the galaxy was able to recognize. And the scale of what is already here is, based on the best estimates the Ordo Xenos has been able to produce through decades of desperate analysis, almost certainly not the main event. But the first warning did not come as a declaration of war. The first warning came as silence. The Magos Varnak was the chief administrator and scientific director of the research outpost on Tyran Primus, a world deep in the eastern fringe of the galaxy, far from the warm light of the Astronomicon and the comforting proximity of Imperial battle fleets. In the year 745 of the 41st millennium, Tyran Primus was home to a modest but scientifically productive facility dedicated to the study of the deep void at the edge of the galactic disk. It was, by the standards of such postings, a quiet and unremarkable assignment. The work was careful and methodical and largely unnoticed by anyone in the wider Imperium. The staff of the facility were accustomed to isolation. They communicated with the wider Imperium through the slow and unreliable channels that were all that was available at such distances from the Astronomicon's light, and they did their work and they lived their lives in the manner of people who have made peace with being very far from anywhere that matters. The silence began with the loss of contact with the listening posts at the edge of the Tyran system. These were automated stations, mostly equipped with the bare minimum of sensory apparatus needed to detect void traffic and transmit basic reports. Their reports were routine and regular, as boring as such reports always are, until the point at which they stopped coming. The cessation of reports from automated stations was not in itself alarming. Equipment failed. Maintenance cycles lapsed. The particular hazards of the deep void were numerous and creative in the ways they destroyed the work of human hands. Varnak noted the absence of reports and dispatched a request for maintenance through the appropriate channels, and went back to his work. Then the inhabited stations stopped reporting. The small facilities at the edges of the Tyranid system, the mining operations and the survey outposts and the small communities that had grown up around them over the decades since the system was first settled, went quiet. One by one, not in a sudden catastrophic silence but in a slow, irregular procession that took several months to complete, each transmission point stopped transmitting. Varnak and his staff attempted to raise them. They received no. They dispatched ships to investigate. The ships did not return. This was alarming. This was the point at which the alarm was justified, and at which, in a better positioned system with faster access to Imperial authority, emergency protocols would have been activated and significant military resources would have been redirected. But Tyranid Primus was far from everything, and the requests for help that Varnak sent through the compromised and partially functional communication channels available to him arrived late and incomplete, and were processed with the bureaucratic thoroughness that characterized Imperial administration, which is to say that they were logged, categorized, and assigned a response priority that placed them several months behind more urgent matters in sectors close to resources that could actually respond. What Varnak and his staff experienced in those final months was the shadow in the warp. They did not have a name for it, because the Imperium had not yet encountered it in sufficient quantity to name it. But they felt it. The psychers on the station reported that their connection to the warp, always the thin and distant and unreliable thing it was on the edge of the galaxy, had begun not in the ordinary way that psychic sensitivity faded with distance from the Astronomicon, not in the familiar dimming that every navigator and astropath posted this far from Terra understood as part of the job. It was something active, something pressing, something that felt, to the psychers who tried to describe it in the reports they filed, like a vast and moving, an absence of the warp that was more than simple distance, more than the absence of light but the presence of something that ate the light. The shadow in the warp is one of the most significant features of Tyranid biology, and one of the most horrifying. It is produced collectively by every Tyranid organism in a hive fleet, a byproduct of whatever psychic connection links the individual organisms to the hive mind, an emanation that propagates ahead of the fleet like the bow wave of an enormous vessel moving through still water. Where the shadow passes, the warp is suppressed. Not destroyed, not replaced, but muted in ways that make it functionally inaccessible. A navigator trying to steer through the shadow finds her connection to the Astronomicon attenuated almost to the point of uselessness, the guiding light reduced to a barely perceptible glimmer that is inadequate for reliable navigation. An astropath trying to send or receive communications through the shadow finds the psychic medium through which those communications travel corrupted and confused, messages dissolving before they can fully form, arriving garbled and incomplete if they arrive. A psyker attempting to reach into the warp for any purpose finds the attempt met with a wall of wrongness, a suffocating absence that is worse, in some ways, than the presences that normally dwell there. For a civilization built on psychic communication, psychic navigation, and the psychic connection to the Emperor that underpins the faith of billions, the shadow in the warp is not merely a tactical inconvenience. It is an existential terror. It severs the threads that connect the Imperium's scattered worlds to each other and to Terra. It cuts off prayer. It renders navigators unreliable and astropaths mute. It isolates every world behind the shadow from the wider Imperium in ways that even the worst warp storm does not quite replicate. Because a warp storm is turbulence, chaos, the warp in excess, and an astropath or a psyker caught in a warp storm is dealing with too much. The shadow is not too much. The shadow is the opposite. Oppressing, comprehensive, terrible too little, and it arrives ahead of the fleet that causes it, a warning that arrives before there is anything to warn against, announcing the approach of the swarm weeks or months before the first bio-ship appears on any sensor capable of detecting it. Varnak's psychers reported the shadow, described it in their reports with increasing distress and decreasing clarity, and then stopped reporting. The last formal record from the research station on Tyran Primus is a data transmission sent by the Magos himself, received partially and incompletely and reconstructed by the Ordo Xenos many years later from the fragments that survived. It describes a darkness in the sky that moved, not the darkness of space, which was familiar and comprehensible and did not move in the way this darkness moved. The darkness of organisms, of a biological mass so dense and so vast that it blocked the stars as it passed, and the stars it blocked did not reappear after it passed, because there was nothing left to reflect or emit the light that would make them visible. The transmission ends mid-sentence. The Ordo Xenos has theorized about what the final word was. They have not been able to reconstruct it with confidence. What they have been able to reconstruct is sufficient. The world of Tyran, which lent its name to the first Hive Fleet designated in Imperial records, was consumed in its entirety. Not bombed, not burned, not conquered and occupied or subjected to the kind of atrocity that the Imperium itself was not above committing in the service of its larger strategic objectives. Consumed, the word is precise, and the precision is important. What the Tyranids did to Tyran was the same thing that a fire does to wood, the same thing that a stomach does to food, the same thing that time does to everything eventually, only faster and more complete and more deliberate in the service of a biological imperative that has no equivalent anywhere else in the known galaxy. The bioships came first, in numbers sufficient to darken the sky from the perspective of anything on the surface fortunate enough to still be watching. They did not bomb the world. They seeded it. Spore pods fell from the fleet in their millions, each one a biological delivery mechanism containing organisms calibrated to specific purposes in the consumption process. Some contained warriors, those multi-armed killing machines that would clear resistance and establish zones of control. Some contained organisms designed for excavation, for reaching the biomass that lay beneath the surface. Some contained the initial stages of the consumption architecture, the biological structures that would eventually transform the surface of the world into the digestion pools from which the hive mind would extract what it needed and discard what it did not. And some contained genostealers, those hyperkinetic advanced predators whose claws could shear through ceramite and whose speed made them effectively impossible to stop once they were in motion. What happened to the people of Tyran in those final hours is not known in detail, because nobody from Tyran survived to report it. What is known from later observations of Tyranid consumption patterns is the general shape of what they experienced. The initial swarm was overwhelming. Not overwhelm in the military sense of superior force applied to a target that might, with different preparation, have been held. overwhelming in the sense of water overwhelming a vessel, filling every space, removing every possibility of resistance, not through any specific tactical brilliance, but through the simple sufficiency of numbers. There was nowhere to retreat to, because the swarm was everywhere. There was nothing to hold, because anything that could be held was surrounded almost immediately. There was no calling for help, because the shadow had already severed those connections. The people of Tyranid died, and as they died they were consumed, because that is what the swarm does. It does not distinguish between living material and dead material. It processes it. After the swarm cleared the surface of everything living, the consumption process moved to the next phase. The digestion pools, those vast biological structures that the Tyranids build and that have no equivalent in any known organism's physiology, began their work. They dissolved everything. Stone, metal, organic matter of every kind, the built environment of everything humanity had constructed on that world, all of it broken down into its constituent components and processed through the biological machinery of the consumption structures into the nutritional substrate that the Hive Fleet required. This took weeks. At the end of those weeks, the ships returned to collect what the pools had produced. And then the ships departed, carrying their cargo of rendered biomass. And the world of Tyran was left behind. What remained was rock. Not a world, not even the ruins of a world. Rock, the geological substrate that the consumption process had determined was not worth the energy expenditure of dissolution. No soil, no water, no atmosphere worth noting. No ruins, no bones, no markers of what had been there before, just rock. Scored clean by biological processes that operated at a level of thoroughness that no bomb or weapon of mass destruction has ever matched. Not even the dead remain to mourn. This is the thing the Ordo Xenos keeps coming back to in its assessments of the Tyranid threat. The thing that distinguishes the Tyranids from every other enemy the Imperium has ever faced in terms of the specific quality of the horror they represent. When chaos destroys a world, the ruins remain. The dead remain, often as a testament to the particular horror that claimed them, sometimes even animated by the energies of the warp into grotesque continuations of their existence. When the orcs conquer a world, the infrastructure changes, but the people often survive, pressed into service, or simply left to exist around the new green-skinned overlords. When the Necrons scour a world, they are at least following an agenda, pursuing something specific, and the destruction they leave behind is the destruction of purpose. When the Tyranids finish with a world, there is nothing. No ghost of what was, no haunting, no legacy, simply an absence, as complete and as final as if the world had never been settled at all, as if the civilization that built its life on that surface had simply never existed. The hive mind does not gloat over what it has consumed. It has no concept of gloating. It simply moves on to the next source of biomass, drawn by the same insatiable biological imperative that drew it to the previous one. As unaware of the devastation it has left behind as a fire is unaware of the ash it produces. The Tyranids are not satisfied by what they... Satisfaction implies a state of completion, a point at which the need is met and the behavior stops. The hive mind has no such point. The consumption is not in service of an end point. The consumption is the point. It will continue until there is nothing left in the galaxy worth consuming, or until the galaxy produces something capable of stopping it, or until something from outside the galaxy calls the swarm back to whatever darkness it came from. None of these outcomes have occurred. The swarm continues. The worlds continue to fall. And the records continue to accumulate in the archives of the Ordo Xenos. Each new entry a testimony to the same terrible truth that Magos Varnak tried to transmit from the surface of Tyran before the swarm reached him. The darkness in the sky moved. And then there was nothing. To understand the horror of the Hive Fleets, we first have to understand what makes them fundamentally different from any other intelligence the galaxy has produced. Not in the obvious physical sense, not in the catalogue of their organisms or the scale of their numbers or the particular quality of the violence they represent, though all of those things matter enormously. We have to understand the Hive mind. Every other intelligence in the galaxy operates through the minds of individual beings. Even the most authoritarian civilization, even the most rigidly controlled hierarchy is ultimately composed of individual consciousnesses, making individual choices within a shared. The human Imperium, despite the God Emperor's psychic presence and the unifying pressure of the Imperial Creed, is a system of billions of individual minds, each processing the world through its own particular architecture of experience and belief and self-interest. Even the Necrons, those ancient skeletal warriors with their semi-suppressed personalities and their loyalty to their pharaohs, retain individual identity at some level of their functioning. Even the Orcs, for all their collective biological momentum, are individual creatures with individual impulses, individual rivalries, individual moments of glory and failure that matter to them in their way. The hive mind is nothing like this. The hive mind is a single consciousness distributed across a fleet that might contain billions of individual organisms. Every Tyranid creature, from the largest biotitan capable of toppling hive cities with a single step, to the smallest Ripper swarm organism barely large enough to be visible at a distance, is a node in this distribute. Each one experiences what it experiences, processes what its sensory organs deliver to it, and transmits that information into the network in real time. The hive mind experiences the battle through all of its organisms simultaneously. It feels the death of each organism not as loss, because loss implies attachment to the thing lost, but as data transmitted through the dying organism's connection to the network and processed by the collective intelligence with the clinical thoroughness of a system designed not to feel but to calculate. This is why individual victories against Tyranid organisms are so profoundly insufficient as a response to the Tyranid threat. When an Imperial Guardsman kills a Tyranid warrior, that warrior, its individual experience ends. But the hive mind does not experience this the way a general experiences the death of a soldier, the way a chapter master experiences the death of a battle brother. The hive mind experiences it the way you experience the feedback of a sensor, a piece of information, processed and incorporated. The warrior's death tells the hive mind something about the weapon that killed it, the angle it came from, the human who fired it, the position of that human in relation to other organisms in the area, the tactical situation in that immediate vicinity. All of this is transmitted in the moment of death and absorbed by the network. The warrior is gone. The knowledge is not. This is also why the hive mind's tactical development across a campaign is so terrifying to the forces that fight it. Military doctrine is built on the idea that an enemy who makes a mistake can be exploited, that a defensive position can be found and held because the enemy will repeat its errors or fail to adapt quickly enough to changing circumstances. Against a conventional enemy, this is a reasonable assumption. Conventional enemies take time to communicate the assessment up and down the chain of command, to develop new doctrines and disseminate them to the forces that need them. This process takes hours at minimum, days or weeks more often, and in large armies fighting across extended fronts, the lag between mistake and correction can be measured in entire campaigns. Against the hive mind, this lag does not exist. The adaptation is instantaneous. Every organism in the fleet that is in range of the network's real-time communication receives the update as soon as it is processed. A tactic that works against the swarm in the first hour of battle will be less effective in the second hour, significantly less effective in the third, and by the fourth hour the swarm will have adapted sufficiently that the tactic is actively dangerous to attempt. Because the hive mind has not only countered it, but has turned the expectation of its use into a trap. This does not mean the Tyranids are unbeatable. They can be beaten, and they have been at enormous cost. But it means that the nature of the fight against them is unlike the nature of any other fight, because improvement does not accumulate on the defender's side the way it accumulates against conventional enemies. Against conventional enemies, a general who fights a battle gains experience that makes the next battle somewhat easier. Against the Tyranids, a general who fights a battle has taught the swarm things that may make the next battle harder. And across the fleet, across multiple engagements in multiple star systems, this learning compounds. The hive mind is not thinking about the battle on this world. It is thinking about the campaign. And the campaign encompasses everything within the fleet's operational range. What it learns on one world informs its approach to the next. The weaknesses it identifies in one species' defensive doctrine are exploited not just immediately but stored in whatever biological mechanism the hive mind uses for storage, and applied to every future engagement with that species. The hive mind that reaches Macragge is not the same hive mind that consumed Tyran. It is the same mind. But it is a mind that has consumed everything between Tyran and Macragge, and learned from every consumption. It arrives at each new engagement not merely better fed, but better informed. The hive fleet that consumed Tyran was given the designation Behemoth by Imperial authorities, following the Ordo Xenos practice of assigning mythological monster names to identified Tyranid fleets. The name is well chosen. In the older mythological traditions, the behemoth was a creature of such vast size that its movement shaped the landscape, its presence a geological event as much as a biological one. Hive Fleet Behemoth moved through the eastern fringe of the galaxy with something of that quality. Its approach detectable not through any single dramatic event, but through the accumulating pattern of absences. The worlds that stopped communicating, the survey ships that failed to return, the gradually extending silence that moved ahead of the fleet like the shadow in the warp that produced it. The Imperium's response to Behemoth was constrained by the same fundamental institutional problem that has constrained the Imperium's response to most threats throughout its history, which is that the Imperium is very large, and communication across it is very slow, and the bureaucratic processes required to redirect significant military resources are not designed for speed. By the time the pattern of silences was recognized as a pattern, by the time the Ordo Xenos had accumulated sufficient evidence to conclude that this was not a natural disaster, or a chaos incursion, or any of the other categories of threat that the Imperium's threat response systems were actually calibrated to handle, Behemoth had consumed dozens of worlds. By the time military assets were redirected toward the threat, Behemoth was deep in the eastern fringe and moving with a focus and a purpose that made its ultimate destination clear to anyone willing to look at the map. The ultimate destination was Macragge. the home world of the Ultramarines, that storied chapter of Space Marines whose lineage traced directly to Rabut Guilliman, the Primarch who had done more than any other single being to shape the Imperium's post-heresy organization. Macrae was not simply a world, not simply a military asset, though it was also those things. It was a symbol, a center of gravity for a significant portion of the Imperium's eastern regions, a world whose fall would reverberate far beyond the military consequences of losing its garrisons and its infrastructure and its population. The hive mind had no awareness of this symbolism. It was not targeting Macrae for reasons of psychological warfare or strategic disruption. It was targeting Macrae because Macrae was a rich source of biomass, large and heavily populated and positioned along the fleet's most efficient route through the eastern fringe. But the consequences of its target selection would have been the same if it had been choosing for strategic reasons. The Ultramarines prepared for the assault with everything they had. Chapter Master Marnius Calgar, a warrior of extraordinary capability and long experience, directed the defense with the comprehensive tactical intelligence that his training and his centuries of service had produced. The orbital defenses were reinforced. The polar fortresses, those vast defensive installations built into the ice caps of Macrae and equipped with weapons capable of engaging targets in orbit, were manned and their systems brought to operational readiness. The chapter's full strength was deployed across the world's most critical defensive positions, with additional support from the Imperial Guard formations stationed on Macrae and the civilian population organized into whatever additional defensive capacity could be mustered from their numbers. What arrived in the Macrae system was not an invasion force in any sense that military tradition had prepared anyone to comprehend. It was a fleet. The word fleet, with its connotations of naval vessels and tactical formations and the relatively manageable engagement geometries of space combat, is inadequate to describe what the approach sensors detected as Behemoth entered the system. The bioships of a hive fleet are not ships in the way that an Imperial battleship is a ship, a manufactured construct of metal and machine spirit and human engineering assembled to perform specific military functions. They are organisms, vast biological entities grown for specific roles in the fleet's operational ecology, each one a living creature of a scale that makes the largest manufactured vessels seem modest. They move through space as living things move, with the purposeful flowing adaptation of biology rather than the geometric precision of engineered systems. And they arrive not in formations designed by tacticians, but in the configuration that serves the biological imperative of the swarm. The bioships of Behemoth arrived in numbers sufficient to overwhelm the orbital defenses through attrition before any more sophisticated tactical consideration became relevant. The Ultramarines' orbital platforms, those carefully positioned and heavily armed installations that represented years of engineering effort and strategic planning, engaged the fleet with everything they had, and inflicted casualties that in any other engagement context would have represented a decisive victory. They destroyed bioships by the hundreds. They wrecked vessels of sizes that no human-built weapon had previously engaged at range. They fought with the excellence that the Ultramarines had maintained for centuries. The disciplined precision of warriors who understood that every moment they held the orbital line was a moment that gave the surface below more time to prepare. The bioships absorbed the losses and continued advancing, not because the hive mind had made a tactical calculation that the losses were acceptable within the parameters of the operation, though they were, But because the hive mind did not process losses the way a military commander processes losses, a human fleet admiral watching his ships destroyed by enemy fire feels the weight of each loss, makes continuous assessments of whether the cost is proportionate to the objective, adjusts the attack plan based on the developing cost calculation. The hive mind registered the destruction of each bioship as information, processed it, adapted the positioning of the remaining ships accordingly, and continued advancing with no more hesitation than a river shows when it encounters a rock in its path. It simply goes around. Or in the case of the orbital defenses, it simply accepted that some portion of the advancing organisms would be destroyed and relied on the sheer mass of what remained to accomplish the objective. The orbital defenses fell, not dramatically, not in a single catastrophic moment of failure, but through the slow, grinding, mathematically inevitable process of the defense platforms running out of ammunition or taking damage that compromised their effectiveness or being overwhelmed at specific points by concentrations of bioships that the remaining defenses could not adequately cover. When the last of the orbital positions was silenced, the sky above Macragge became something that the planet had never seen, something that no civilized world had ever seen and survived to describe with clarity. The shadow of the fleet was an actual shadow. The bioships in their numbers blocked the light. The assault on the surface began with spores, not the metaphorical spores of infection, not biological contamination in any sense that the Imperium's understanding of biological warfare had prepared anyone to categorize. Actual spores, organisms adapted for the specific purpose of atmospheric entry, each one a self-contained biological package designed to survive the transition from orbit to surface and to deploy whatever payload it carried in the best possible position for the swarm's overall purposes. Millions of them fell on Macragge. Tens of millions. The sky burned with their entry for hours, a false dawn of biological fire. And then they struck the surface and they opened, and everything that came out of them began its work. Marneus Calgar fought. This is not a simple statement. Calgar was a figure of such military accomplishment that his name was known across the Imperium as a shorthand for competence and toughness, and the kind of leadership that holds together the fabric of a defensive line when everything else argues for its dissolution. He coordinated the defense of multiple critical positions simultaneously, directing forces through communications networks that the shadow in the warp had degraded but not entirely severed, making tactical decisions with the speed that the Tyranid assault demanded, and the precision that the Ultramarines' tradition required. He fought personally at the breaking points, those places where the Tyranid tide was closest to crashing through entirely, contributing his own considerable martial capability to the defense in ways that were not merely symbolic but operationally critical. The polar fortresses were among the most significant defensive positions on Macragge, massive installations built into the ice caps that anchored both ends of the planetary defense network. Their weapon systems were of a scale that could engage targets in the upper atmosphere, and their structural reinforcement meant that they could sustain combat damage that would have reduced most military installations to rubble. Calgar understood their importance. The Tyranids understood it too, in their way, in the way that the hive mind understood everything it faced, through the constant real-time information flow from the organisms engaging the defenses and the constant adaptation of the assault to exploit the weaknesses that information revealed. What the Ultramarines found in the polar fortresses, after the assault was finally beaten, after the bioships were destroyed and the swarm was broken and the battle was over, was something that has never been adequately described in any official account. because no official account has found language adequate to the specific quality of the horror it represented. A Tyranid warrior, one of the synapse creatures whose psychic connection to the hive mind served as a relay and a commander for the lesser organisms around it, lay dead in the fortress. Dead, and yet still there, still intact in its alien physicality, its multiple limbs in the positions of its final moment. The Ultramarines had seen the aftermath of battles before. They had seen the dead of 100 species and 100 conflicts. But this was different. And the difference is hard to articulate precisely. The difference was the alienness. Not the superficial alienness of unusual morphology. Not the alienness of an organism that had a different number of limbs or different sensory organs than a human being. The alienness of a thing that had never had any reference point in common with humanity, that had never shared any evolutionary context with anything the human genetic heritage had ever encountered or adapted to. The Tyranid warrior was wrong in the way that something is wrong when it does not belong to the same framework of existence that everything familiar belongs to. It was a messenger from outside the galaxy, and looking at it felt like standing at the edge of the knowable universe and looking into the dark. The first and second companies of the Ultramarines had been stationed in the polar fortresses, 2 full companies of veterans. Warriors who had served the chapter for decades and in some cases centuries. The accumulated excellence of 2 of the most storied fighting brotherhoods in a chapter renowned for the quality of its warriors. They died in the fortress. All of them. Not retreating. Not breaking, holding the line with the discipline that their training and their brotherhood and their deep personal commitment to the protection of the world they were defending had instilled in them. They held the fortresses until the fortresses were held. And then there was nothing left of them to recover. This is the specific quality of the cost that the battle for Macragge extracted. Not simply a death toll, not simply a number that could be compared against other numbers and assessed in terms of proportionality and strategic value. The loss of the first and second companies was the loss of irreplaceable experience, irreplaceable capability, irreplaceable brotherhood, lost not in the service of a failed defense but in the service of a successful one, which made the loss, if anything, harder to process. They had not died in vain. The fortress had held. The battle had been won. The fleet had been turned, eventually, through the desperate intervention of a relieving naval force from Segmentum Solar, and the continued resistance on the ground. Behemoth was broken. But broken did not mean gone. The remnants of the fleet, those bioships that survived the engagement, scattered, and the hive mind did not stop thinking simply because this fleet had been defeated. The knowledge that Behemoth had gathered in its long approach through the eastern fringe, all those consumed worlds and engaged defenders and tested fortifications, did not die with the fleet. The question of how exactly the hive mind preserves information across the destruction of individual fleet elements is one that the Ordo Xenos has studied extensively and answered only partially. But the evidence of subsequent hive fleet behavior suggests that the answer is not simply that the information is lost. The galaxy is not large enough in certain uncomfortable ways for that to be true. The Ultramarines rebuilt. Macragge was scarred but not consumed, its population reduced but not annihilated, its infrastructure damaged but functional. The chapter, reduced by the loss of its first and second companies and the other casualties of the defense, rebuilt its strength with the grim patience that Space Marine tradition applied to such things, recruiting new warriors from Macragge's population and from the successor worlds that supplied the chapter's gene seed program. It took years. The scars on Macragge remained visible for decades, and in the archives of the Ordo Xenos, Inquisitor Cryptman and his colleagues began the long, obsessive work of trying to understand what they had just seen. What they had just seen, their analysis gradually concluded, was not a fleet. It was a tendril, a single arm of a much larger entity dispatched through the galaxy ahead of the main mass to assess resources and clear defenses and render the approach of what came after more efficient. This conclusion was not immediately accepted. It had significant institutional resistance because accepting it required accepting the implications, and the implications were of a kind that, if widely distributed, would do significant damage to the orderly function of the institutions that needed to remain functional if the Imperium was going to survive what was coming. The conclusion was sealed. The implications were set aside for later consideration when there was more evidence. There was more evidence. It arrived in the form of Hive Fleet Kraken. Before Kraken arrived, however, it sent its servants ahead. It had been sending them ahead for longer than anyone had realized. The Genestealer cult is perhaps the most insidious mechanism that Tyranids have developed. Not because it represents superior biological engineering in the combat sense. Not because the organisms involved are more dangerous than the combat bioforms, whose descriptions fill the Ordo Xenos' threat assessments with the particular mixture of scientific precision and barely contained horror that characterizes good analysis of genuinely terrible things. It is the most insidious mechanism, because it operates through the one vulnerability that no amount of military preparation can entirely close. It operates through the people, the civilization being targeted. The Genestealer is the advance agent of the Tyranid swarm, a creature whose physiology has been refined over a timescale that the Ordo Xenos cannot adequately measure into the perfect instrument of infiltration and preparation. It is not large by the standards of Tyranid organisms. A fully adult Genestealer is roughly the size of a large man, and while it is considerably more dangerous than a large man in direct physical confrontation, its value to the hive mind is not primarily as a combatant. Its value is what it does to the people it encounters that it does not immediately kill. The Genestealer carries in its biology a mechanism of hybridization that has no equivalent anywhere else in the known galaxy. When it implants its genetic material into a host, through a process that the Ordo Xenos documents in clinical detail and that is deeply unpleasant to read about, it does not simply infect the host in the conventional biological sense. It initiates a multi-generational transformation. The first-generation hybrid, the child of the infected host, appears largely normal, largely human. The modifications are internal and subtle, the alien genetic influence present but not dominant. This child grows up as a normal member of whatever community they were born into, interacting with that community in all the ways that community members interact, forming relationships and building trust, and achieving whatever positions of social or professional influence they are capable of achieving. They carry the alien influence in their genes, and they carry something else as well. A deep and inarticulate psychic pull that they can neither explain nor resist. A longing whose object they cannot name, because they do not know what it is. Their children are more obviously changed. The alien influence expresses more strongly in the second generation, producing physical characteristics that require concealment, that mark the bearer as something different, something that must be hidden from neighbors and authorities and casual acquaintances if the individual is to continue functioning within the community they have penetrated. This necessity of concealment creates its own social structure. The second-generation hybrids, unable to be entirely open about their nature, find each other through the psychic connection that the Genestealer's influence has established. They form networks. They build institutions, often hidden within apparently innocent organizations, worker collectives, religious congregations, charitable associations, that serve as cover for the growing community of changed individuals, and as recruitment structures for bringing more of the community into the fold. By the third generation, the hybrids are unmistakably alien in their appearance. 4 arms, chitinous protrusions, eyes that have changed in ways that cannot be concealed by ordinary means. These individuals live entirely in the hidden community, unable to pass as normal members of whatever civilization their predecessors infiltrated. They are warriors primarily, and they have gifts that the first and second generation members lack. The beginning of the psychic sensitivity that will characterize the fourth generation fully, an enhanced physical capability that makes them formidable combatants, and a connection to the Patriarch that is immediate and unmediated. The Patriarch is the original Genestealer, or one of a line of originals, the founding organism whose biological influence has propagated through all the generations of the cult. It is ancient, if it has survived long enough, and it is powerful in ways that go beyond its considerable physical capability. Its psychic influence is the glue that holds the cult together, the source of the pull that every hybrid feels throughout their lives, the focal point of the cult's religious observance. Because the Genestealer cult is a religion, in the functional if not the theological sense, the hybrids worship, in their way, not the 4-armed emperor that their ceremonies invoke, but the Patriarch, and through the Patriarch the distant call of the hive mind that the Patriarch is transmitting toward, the call that is coming toward them as the fleet approaches, the call that is the entire purpose of everything the cult has been building toward since the first generation of hybrids was. The fourth generation hybrid is, physically, barely distinguishable from a pure-blood Genestealer. The alien genetic influence has dominated almost entirely. They are warriors of the cult at their most capable, and they are the ones who breed back with the original Genestealer line to begin the cycle again, producing first-generation offspring who can pass as human and restart the infiltration process in new social contexts, spread the cult wider, bring more people into the fold. What the cult is doing, through all of this generational complexity, is preparing the world it has infected for the arrival of the fleet. The psychic signal that the Patriarch transmits is not only a signal from the fleet to the cult, telling the cult that it is coming. It is also a signal from the cult to the fleet, a beacon that the hive mind uses to locate its target. The cult is calling the hybrids, who believe they are awaiting the arrival of their god, are accurate in their understanding that something vast and powerful is coming in response to their calling. They are simply wrong, in the profound and tragic way of religious believers who have devoted their lives to a faith whose actual object is nothing like what they have about the nature of what they have called and what it intends for them. When the fleet arrives, the cult rises. The years of infiltration produce an insurgency coordinated with the orbital assault in ways that are devastatingly effective. The defensive infrastructure has been compromised by cult members in positions of trust, and the military response is confused and disrupted by the simultaneous need to defend against the assault from orbit and to suppress the uprising emerging from within. The world falls faster than it would have fallen without the cult's preparation, which was the point of the cult's existence. After the world falls, the cult members are consumed along with everything, their biological material processed into biomass with the same thoroughness and the same indifference that the hive mind brings to all the material it encounters. The patriarch is consumed. The hybrids are consumed, the first-generation members who spent their lives believing that something was coming for them, something that felt, in the psychic haze of the Genestealer's influence, like completion, like family, like arrival at a destination they had been approaching all their lives, were right that something was coming. They were wrong about everything else. How long can a Genestealer cult exist before the fleet arrives? Years, certainly, decades, in some documented cases. Generations. There are cults operating in the Imperium right now whose founding Genestealers infected the first host centuries ago, whose call has been propagating through the warp for longer than most living humans have been alive, whose members have been building their hidden networks and performing their ceremonies and awaiting their god's arrival through so many generations that the specific nature of their founding has passed into the status of myth. The Ordo Xenos is aware of some of these cults. It is certainly not aware of all of them. Every world in the Imperium is a potential candidate. Every community whose social fabric has been penetrated by something that disguises itself as ordinary life is a potential host. And the warning signs are, by design, invisible to anyone who does not know exactly what they are looking for. The Imgal Genestealers represent a specific and particularly disturbing subcategory of this threat. Found on the moon of Imgal in the depths of the eastern fringe, these creatures predated any known hive fleet contact with the region, which raised questions whose implications the Ordo Xenos has never been entirely comfortable examining. The oldest known Tyranid organisms in the galaxy. The question they raise is one of timeline, of how long the Tyranids have been sending their advance agents ahead of their fleets, of how much time passed between the first Genestealer arriving on Imgal and the first bioship arriving in the Tyrant system. The answer that the evidence implies is uncomfortable. The answer implies centuries at minimum of preparation that went unrecognized because the Imperium was not looking for it. Not looking for it because it did not know that anything existed that would require looking for exactly this. Hive Fleet Kraken arrived in 992 of the 41st millennium. And it arrived differently from Behemoth. The Imperium had learned from Behemoth certain things. It had learned that Tyranid fleets approached in ways that could be detected if you knew what you were looking for. That the pattern of silences preceded the assault in ways that gave, in theory, some warning time. It had learned that orbital defenses needed to be massive and redundant to have any chance of affecting the approach of a hive. It had learned that the surface of a contested world needed to be defended at depth, with multiple layers of fallback positions, because the weight of the Tyranid assault would break any single defensive line regardless of how strong it was. It had learned, in short, how to defend against Behemoth. The hive mind had learned from Behemoth too. The hive mind had learned how the Imperium it had processed the tactical and strategic information that Behemoth's failed assault had provided and had produced, in the form of Kraken, something different. Something that did not replicate Behemoth's approach. Because Behemoth had attacked in a concentrated mass, a single fleet moving along a single axis of advance with the weight and the momentum of something too large to be deflected. This had certain advantages. It was overwhelming at the point of application, but it was also identifiable and counterable in theory, because concentration implies a predictable axis of advance and a predictable point. Once you knew where Behemoth was going, you knew where to build your defenses. Kraken distributed. It came not as a single fleet but as multiple tendrils, dozens of them, advancing simultaneously along different axes of approach and striking different targets with a coordination that the hive mind's real-time information sharing made possible even across distances that would have made human coordination impossible. Each tendril was smaller than Behemoth had been. Each was also more difficult to predict and more difficult to intercept, because the resources that might have been concentrated against a single axis of advance were necessarily spread to address multiple simultaneous threats. The worlds in Kraken's path fell faster than the worlds in Behemoth's path, not because each individual tendril was more powerful, but because the distribution of the threat made adequate response to any individual one essentially impossible without abandoning response to the others. And Kraken moved faster. Not the bioships themselves, not in any strictly measurable biological sense, but the pattern of the fleet's advance, which had been modified by whatever processing the hive mind had done on the information from Behemoth's campaign, was less concerned with the methodical consumption of every available world in its path, and more focused on reaching priority targets with maximum speed. It bypassed some worlds that Behemoth would have consumed thoroughly. The bypassed worlds would be dealt with by later swarms, or by the organisms left behind from the initial assault. Speed in the campaign against Kraken was a weapon as much as mass. The fall of Craftworld Iyanden is one of the most significant events in the history of the Tyranid invasion. Not because of the scale of the loss relative to Imperial losses, though the scale was enormous, but because of what it revealed about the specific nature of the horror the Tyranids represented to a species that was not human. The Eldar, those ancient beings who had known since long before humanity achieved spaceflight that something was coming, who had included warnings of the Great Devourer in their mythological tradition millennia before the first contact at Tyran, faced the Tyranids with a specific quality of existential dread that humans did not fully share. Not because the Eldar were more sensitive or more prescient, though they were both, but because the Tyranids threatened the Eldar with something worse than death. To understand the fall of Iyanden, you need to understand what an Eldar craft world is. Not in the architectural sense, not as a description of the vast vessel that carries an Eldar population through the stars, though it is also that. A craft world is a repository of souls. Literally, the infinity circuit that runs through every craft world is a psychic network, a spiritual infrastructure that contains the souls of the craft world's dead. When an Eldar dies, their soul stone, the psychic repository that every Eldar carries during life to prevent their soul from being consumed by the warp, is placed in the infinity circuit, and the soul it contains becomes part of the craft world's collective psychic presence. The dead of Iyanden were there, in the circuit, in a form of continued existence that was diminished compared to life, but was still existence, still awareness, still connection to the community whose living members continued to maintain the craft world and honor the memory of those who had passed into the circuit. The Tyranids threatened to consume this, not simply to kill the living population of Iyanden, Though they were prepared to do that, they threatened to consume the craft world itself, to process it into biomass with the same indifferent thoroughness they applied to everything else, which would destroy the infinity circuit and scatter the psychic energies it contained into a warp that offered no refuge for Eldar souls. The dead of Iyanden, those accumulated generations of souls preserved in the circuit, would not simply cease to exist in the way that human death ends individual consciousness. They would be dissolved into the sea of souls, their identities eroding away in the psychic tides of a dimension hostile to everything they had ever been. The Eldar have a word for this that does not translate cleanly into any human language, but the closest approximation is something like unbecoming. Not death, something worse than death. The destruction of everything that the person was. Retroactively, Iyanden was warned. The craft world's Farseers, those Eldar psychers whose role was to navigate the vast psychic tides of possible futures and identify the paths that led to better outcomes, had foreseen the possibility of Kraken's attack and had issued their warnings with the particular specificity that Eldar precognition sometimes achieved. The warnings were not heeded with the urgency they deserved, for reasons that the Eldar's political culture of the time had made inevitable, and that the craft world's subsequent history had given Iyanden's surviving population many years to regret. Prince Iriel, Iyanden's greatest military commander, had been exiled some years before Kraken's arrival following a political dispute that the surviving records describe in varying terms depending on which account you credit. Iriel himself had taken his followers and become a corsair, that particular category of Eldar outlaw who lives outside the craft world system and pursues their own purposes through the galaxy's margins. He was, by the time Kraken arrived, far from a... What arrived at Iyanden was not a tendril of Kraken. It was a major component of the fleet, one of the largest concentrations of Kraken's bioships, drawn to the craft world's psychic emanations with the same unerring instinct that drew the hive mind toward any rich concentration of biomass. The infinity circuit was, in psychic terms, extraordinarily attractive, a vast repository of psychic energy that the hive mind's sensory apparatus could detect across interstellar distances, and that represented a harvest of a kind the swarm had rarely encountered. The battle for Iyanden was the longest and most destructive engagement in the craft world's history. The Eldar fought with everything they had, with the ghost warriors, those ancient war constructs animated by the souls of the dead drawn from the infinity circuit itself. Those warriors who fought in mechanical bodies while their souls were temporarily withdrawn from the circuit, serving once in the flesh equivalent of their preserved spiritual state before returning to their accustomed home in the network. The ghost warriors of Iyanden were its history made martial, its dead called back into service to defend the living who remained, and they fought with the particular intensity of beings who understood exactly what was at stake, who were not simply defending a military position but defending the conditions of their own continued spiritual existence. Iyanden lost. Not entirely, not completely, but it came close enough to complete loss that the difference is measured in the surviving leadership's willingness to count it as survival rather than defeat. Kraken consumed vast portions of the craft world, killed hundreds of thousands of the living population, and damaged the infinity circuit in ways that destroyed or scattered portions of the accumulated dead that the circuit contained. The loss of those souls, those irreplaceable personalities who had waited in the circuit for whatever form of continuation the Eldar conception of afterlife offered, was a wound in Iyanden's collective consciousness, that has not healed, and perhaps cannot. Iriel returned. Whatever the political dispute that had driven him from Iyanden, the arrival of the Tyranid fleet made everything else secondary. He came back with his corsairs and threw them into the battle with the reckless, furious commitment of a warrior who had decided that the thing that had driven him away from his home was nothing compared to the thing that was threatening to destroy it. He fought through the corridors of the craft world in engagements that the Eldar record with the mythological weight they reserve for moments that define the character of a people. He took up the Spear of Twilight, a weapon of terrible power whose use carried a curse that the Eldar tradition understood with the clarity of long experience, whose wielder it would slowly destroy even as it gave them the capability to fight on an otherwise impossible scale. He used it, and Kraken's forces in the craft world were eventually driven back. The cost was everything. Iyanden after Kraken was a ghost craft world, its population reduced to a fraction of what it had been, its infinity circuit scarred and diminished, its ghost warriors serving not as the honored dead temporarily recalled to service, but as the necessary army of a population too reduced to field adequate living forces. The dead now outnumbered the living in Iyanden's military deployments, not because the Eldar had chosen this configuration, but because there were not enough living to fill the ranks that needed filling. Iriel survived, the curse of the spear working slowly through him, his lifespan measured in the gradual toll of a weapon that was killing him more slowly than it had killed the enemies he wielded it against. Kraken was broken eventually, not by any single engagement, not by any strategic masterstroke, but by the accumulated effort of every force that engaged it across the multiple axes of its advance. The Ultramarines committed heavily, other Space Marine chapters deployed against different tendrils. The Imperial Guard threw its enormous and expendable manpower into defensive positions that slowed the advance long enough for counterstrikes to be organized. And there was, in the particular chaotic way that the galaxy sometimes provides its own solutions to its own problems, the Orc Warg, that happened to be moving through the same region of the eastern fringe at roughly the same time, that encountered several of Kraken's tendrils and engaged them with the particular enthusiastic violence that orcs bring to anything they encounter that fights back. The orcs did not defeat Kraken. The orcs did not defeat Kraken any more than a rock in a river defeats the river. But the orcs occupied some of the tendrils that might otherwise have hit more critical targets. And the hive mind, in its real-time assessment of the tactical situation, allocated resources to those engagements that might otherwise have been allocated elsewhere. And the overall momentum of Kraken's advance was fractionally reduced by this, which was fractionally more than the difference between the positions that held and the positions that fell. In the mathematics of galactic invasion, fractions can be the difference between civilizations. But Kraken's tendrils scattered when the fleet's cohesion was broken. Not destroyed. Not consumed. Scattered small concentrations of bioships that had lost connection to the main hive mind communication network, reverting to a more basic and more feral form of Tyranid behavior. Spreading through the galaxy in irregular patterns, striking at whatever targets presented themselves with the opportunistic ferocity of organisms that still carried the hive mind's purpose, but without the hive mind's full coordination. These splinter fleets are still out there. Some have been located and destroyed at great cost. Some have been tracked and contained, in the sense that their movements are monitored and forces are positioned to respond when they strike. Some have simply disappeared into the galaxy's vast dark spaces, lost and untracked, emerging from the void to consume a settlement or a convoy or a patrol, and then vanishing again before any adequate response can be organized. Every splinter fleet is a potential threat. Every splinter fleet is also a potential learning mechanism, collecting data that is, through whatever the hive mind uses for long-range communication, potentially available to the main swarm. The knowledge that the Imperium has fought for against Kraken may be flowing back to the intelligence that will be used to design whatever comes after Kraken. Victory is never simply victory. Every victory carries a darker truth. The swarm was learning. To understand what actually happens when the Tyranids take a world, you have to set aside the metaphors that make it manageable and look at the process directly. Because the metaphors, however useful they are for communicating the scale of the horror, tend to soften it in ways that obscure the specific quality of what is being described. The Tyranid consumption of a world is not like a fire. Not exactly. Fire is destructive, but it is also indifferent in a way that implies no purpose. The Tyranid consumption is purposeful. It is biological industry operating at planetary scale, with organisms specifically evolved for each stage of the process, and a coordination that makes the whole vastly more efficient than any human industrial enterprise operating at any scale. The bioships do not simply deposit the swarm and wait. They are themselves active participants in the consumption process. In orbit above a targeted world, they perform functions that the ground organisms cannot perform, processing the mineral content of the space environment, capturing and converting whatever energy is available from the system's star, and maintaining the biological infrastructure of the fleet itself. They are alive in a way that manufactured spacecraft are not, sustained by biological processes that the Adeptus Mechanicus has studied at length and understands only partially, capable of self-repair at rates that make inflicting permanent damage on them in combat extremely difficult. When a bioship is killed, the hive mind begins replacing it through the same biological process that built it in the first place, assuming sufficient biomass is available from whatever consumption is ongoing. The fleet regenerates. The fleet is not a collection of machines that can be degraded past the point of function. The fleet is a living thing that heals. On the surface, the initial assault organisms clear resistance. The combat bioforms that descend from the spore pods are calibrated to the specific defensive configuration of the target, which the hive mind has been gathering intelligence on through every available channel, including the Genestealer cult if one is present, including long-range biological sensors deployed ahead of the fleet, including the direct observation of the assault organisms themselves as they encounter defenders and transmit information about weapon effects and defensive positions in real time. The adaptation is continuous. What fails in the first wave is modified or replaced by something better calibrated in the subsequent waves. The assault does not pause. The information processing does not pause. The swarm is learning the specific defensive configuration of this specific world in real time and applying what it learns immediately. The specific organisms that the Tyranids deploy vary by target and by phase of the assault, but certain bioforms appear consistently enough across documented engagements to have been studied in some detail by the Ordo Xenos. Understanding what these organisms are and what they do provides a more direct window into the nature of the Tyranid threat than any amount of strategic or philosophical analysis. The Lictor is one of the most feared and arguably one of the most psychologically significant of the Tyranid organisms. Not because it is the most powerful, though it is formidable because of what it does before the assault begins and how it operates during the assault, which together reveal something about the hive mind's understanding of the military importance of command and communication, and the psychic connection that Space Marine chapters and other Imperial forces depend on. A lictor is a scout and an assassin, deployed ahead of the main swarm in small numbers, sometimes individually, to infiltrate a target world and gather intelligence and to specifically hunt particular categories of prey. The categories it prioritizes are not chosen for their physical capability or their individual military value. They are chosen for their role in the communication and coordination structures of the defending forces. Astropaths, psychers, officers and commanders. The lictor does not simply kill. It hunts with a patience and a thoroughness that has no equivalent in human military doctrine. Because the lictor is a creature whose entire biology is optimized for exactly this purpose and that has been doing it for longer, in the aggregate experience of the hive mind, than most human military doctrines have existed. The lictor can blend into almost any environment. Its chameleon skin, a biological adaptation that the Adeptus Mechanicus has studied extensively without replicating, makes it effectively invisible to normal visual observation in most conditions. Its feeder tendrils allow it to extract memories from its prey, which are then available to the hive mind as intelligence about local defensive arrangements and communication protocols. Its presence in an area produces a specific quality of psychic disturbance that psychers in the area often perceive before they are aware of the lictor itself. A wrongness at the edge of psychic perception that experienced psychers have learned to recognize, and that newer or less experienced ones often do not interpret correctly until it is too late. Deathleaper is the name given to one specific and particularly notorious lictor, an individual organism whose campaign against a particular Imperial position demonstrated both the intelligence of which a lictor is capable and the specific quality of psychological warfare that can be conducted by a single organism operating over an extended period. It targeted not the military capability of its opponents, but their psychological coherence, hunting close enough to be felt without being engaged, killing in ways that maximized fear and minimized the tactical intelligence the defenders could gather from its activities, driving the senior staff of a besieged facility to the edge of psychological breakdown through a campaign of terror conducted so precisely that the hive mind's intelligence in designing it must be inferred from the results. When the main swarm arrived, the defenders were already broken in ways that the main swarm had not needed to produce and would have required significant additional effort and material to produce if the lictor had not done it first. The hive mind does not waste resources. The lictor is one of the ways it conserves them. The genestealer, in its role as a combat organism, is something that the descriptions of its infiltration capabilities tend to undersell. It is not simply the advance agent of the cult, not simply the genetic precursor of the hybrid generations. It is a killing machine whose physical capabilities represent the convergence of hundreds of millions of years of predatory evolution, refined and focused by the hive mind's biological engineering into something that outperforms almost every other organism of equivalent size in terms of raw combat capability. Its claws, which can separate ceramite power armor along its joints, are the product of biological adaptations whose metallurgical properties the Adeptus Mechanicus has been unable to fully characterize. Its speed exceeds that of unaugmented humans by a factor that makes evasion impossible, and reaction time a relevant variable only at the scale of Space Marine reflexes. And it is, like all Tyranid organisms, capable of sustaining damage that would incapacitate most organisms and continuing to function. Because the hive mind prioritizes the operational continuation of organisms that are still effective over the conservation of organisms that are already compromised beyond usefulness. The Carnifex is not subtle. The Carnifex is not a subtle organism, and nothing about its design suggests that subtlety was a consideration in its development. It is a living siege engine, a creature that the hive mind deploys against fortified positions and armored targets with the same casual indifference that a human army deploys artillery against a defensive emplacement. A fully mature Carnifex is approximately the size of a battle tank. It is approximately as well armored as a battle tank. It does not carry weapons in any manufactured sense. It is its weapons. The massive crushing limbs and the reinforced skull and the biological ranged weaponry that some configurations incorporate growing directly from the organism's body. It sustains fire that would destroy armored vehicles. It continues advancing. It hits things. The things break. What makes the Carnifex tactically significant is not its individual capability, which is extraordinary, but not uniquely so in a universe that contains space marines and orc dreadnoughts and Tau battlesuits, and a dozen other categories of devastating individual combatants. What makes it tactically significant is what it says about the hive mind's willingness to deploy biological capital in the tactical context. The Carnifex is expensive in biological terms, in the sense that producing it requires significant invested biomass and significant developmental time. The hive mind deploys them in the hundreds in major assaults. Dozens of biological entities, each representing a substantial investment of resources, committed without hesitation to the direct engagement of defensive positions. Because the hive mind's calculation of optimal resource allocation always arrives at the same conclusion: more pressure, faster. The defensive positions are temporary. The biomass they cost to overcome is recoverable from the consumption that follows the position's fall. The Hive Tyrant is the most sophisticated tactical intelligence the swarm deploys at the ground combat level. It is large, heavily armored, physically formidable in ways that place it at the extreme end of Tyranid ground combat capabilities, but its military significance lies less in what it can do physically than in what it does psychically. The Hive Tyrant is a synapse relay of exceptional strength and clarity, its connection to the hive mind more robust and more nuanced than that of most other synapse creatures, capable of coordinating the activities of thousands of organisms in its vicinity with a precision that no other organism of comparable combat capability can match, while also fighting on its own account. It does not it participates in the direction of the swarm while remaining available as a combat asset. This dual function is something that no human military doctrine has produced an equivalent to, because human military doctrine does not assume that the most capable tactical commander will also be among the most capable direct combatants, and does not design around making that assumption work. The Swarm Lord is something else entirely. It is a designation, not a species. The name given to the apex expression of the Hive Tyrant evolutionary strain. The organism that the hive mind produces when it needs something that combines the physical capability of the most formidable combat organisms with the tactical intelligence of a genuinely strategic mind. The Swarm Lord is unique in Tyranid biology in one specific way that the Ordo Xenos has been able to confirm, and that has significant implications for the nature of the hive mind itself. When a Swarm Lord is killed, the hive mind does not simply rebuild it from available biological resources as it rebuilds most organisms. It rebuilds it with the memories of its previous incarnation intact, not an approximation of those memories. The actual memories, preserved through whatever the hive mind uses for long-term information storage, reinvested in the new biological matrix of the rebuilt organism. A swarmlord that has fought the Ultramarines on Macragge and been killed in that fight carries the memory of that fight into every subsequent engagement it participates in. It remembers Marneus Calgar. It remembers what Calgar's tactics were in that specific engagement, and what options they provided and what they cost. The fight against the Swarmlord is never a fresh engagement on its side. Every battle it survives adds to a pool of direct tactical experience that it carries into the next battle. Every battle it does not survive adds to the same pool in the next incarnation. This is why the Swarmlord at Earnden was more dangerous than the Swarmlord that had fought in any previous engagement. Not because its body had been improved, though the hive mind does refine the biological design continuously. Because it was not fighting for the first time. It was fighting with the accumulated direct experience of everything it had encountered before. And it was fighting the Eldar, whose defensive doctrine it had every reason to understand better than the Eldar would have wished. The planetary consumption process itself, the final stage that follows the clearing of resistance, is something that the Ordo Xenos describes in reports that most Imperial military commanders never read, because the information is not relevant to the operational questions they are trying to answer. It is relevant to other questions, the ones about what the Tyranid threat actually means in the largest possible context, and those questions are the ones that this account is trying to address. Once resistance on a targeted world is broken, the swarm shifts from combat operations to consumption operations. The distinction is less sharp than it might seem, because the organisms that perform consumption are not separate from the organisms that perform combat. Many of them are capable of both functions, with simple biological reorientation. But the priority changes. The emphasis shifts from neutralizing threats to processing biome. The digestion pools are established across the surface, biological structures that are grown from Tyranid organisms in ways that are biologically extraordinary, and that the Adeptus Mechanicus has been able to study in a few cases of worlds liberated before consumption was complete. They dissolve organic matter through a combination of biological acids and enzymatic processes, reducing everything they process to a nutritional slurry that is then transmitted upward through biological conduits to the waiting bioships in orbit. Not simply living material. Everything, the buildings, the manufactured goods, the dead bodies, the soil that has been enriched by centuries of biological activity, all of it dissolved and processed, and the Norn Queens, those vast biological engines that serve as the production centers of the Hive Fleet, receive this material and allocate it. Some goes to the immediate replacement of organisms lost in the assault. Some goes to the production of new organisms for the next campaign. Some goes to the repair and maintenance of the bioships that sustain damage during the engagement. And some, the portion that exceeds the fleet's immediate needs, is stored in whatever biological form the hive mind uses for surplus resource storage, carried forward to the next system, available for deployment as needed. The Ripper swarms are the final act. Small organisms barely more than collections of teeth and digestive apparatus and enough biological coherence to seek out whatever has been missed by the larger consumers. They move through the processed surface in their millions in the final hours of consumption, catching and processing everything that the digestion pools have not reached, ensuring that the inventory of available biomass is complete. After the Ripper swarms have passed, there is nothing of biological significance left on the surface. After the digestion pools are deconstructed and their material is transmitted upward, there is nothing of manufactured significance left on the surface either. What remains is what was there before life colonized the world. Rock, naked, clean, stripped rock, and the thin remnants of an atmosphere that the biological processes of an active world had enriched over millions of years, and that the Tyranids have no interest in. The Ordo Xenos has analyzed the surface of several worlds consumed by the Tyranids where the consumption process was interrupted and the fleet departed before completion, or where deep geological surveys were conducted after Imperial forces retook the system. The analysis is consistent. The rate of biological material removal from a fully consumed world represents essentially 100% of the biomass inventory that was present before the swarm arrived. The measurement is not quite at 100%, because the instruments capable of detecting the marginal amounts that remain are capable of detecting amounts that have no practical significance. For all purposes relevant to the question of whether anything will ever live on this world again, without extraordinary terraforming effort measured in geological timescales, the world is sterile, completely and permanently sterile. Not bombed into sterility, not poisoned into sterility, eaten into sterility, with a thoroughness that no other process in the known galaxy produces. And this is where the nightmare becomes something worse than invasion. Because the Tyranids are not simply an enemy force that can be defeated through sufficient application of military power, though they can be defeated at individual engagements, and have been. They are a biological mechanism whose operation has implications that extend beyond any individual campaign or any individual fleet. Every world they consume becomes material for more organisms. Every battle they fight teaches them how to fight better. Every fleet that is destroyed produces biological remnants that drift through the void and eventually aggregate into new biological structures, new potential, new organisms. The swarm does not have a fixed size that can be reduced past the point of the swarm has an available resource pool that is continuously replenished by its own operations, and the resource pool is currently expanding because the swarm is consuming more than it is losing. Hive Fleet Leviathan arrived at the close of the 41st millennium, and it arrived from below, the Imperium's defensive doctrine against Tyranid threats, such as it was, had been organized around the assumption that the Hive fleets would continue to approach from the eastern fringe. This was where Behemoth had come from. This was where Kraken had come. This was where the first contact at Tyran had occurred, and the mass of the inquisitorial analysis of the Tyranid threat was organized around the question of what would come next through the region of space that the eastern fringe represented. Naval assets were positioned accordingly. Alert networks were established accordingly. The pattern of Tyranid threat had, by the late 41st millennium, established a kind of institutional expectation. Leviathan attacked from below the galactic plane, not from the eastern fringe, from beneath, from the region of galactic space that the Imperium's attention had not been directed toward because nothing significant had ever come from there before. Because the Tyranid behavioral pattern as understood had established expectations that were, it turned out, based on insufficient data. There were no defensive preparations in the regions Leviathan came through. There were no alert networks. There was no institutional readiness. There was just the silence of the shadow moving upward through space that nobody was watching. And then the swarm arriving in the middle regions of the galaxy simultaneously from multiple tendrils in a coordinated assault that had the advantage of complete surprise. Leviathan was the largest of the three great hive fleets. The scale of what the Ordo Xenos was able to assess before assessment became impossible due to the Shadow's suppression of communication is difficult to convey in terms that maintain meaning at the level of individual comprehension. A fleet large enough that its bioships could be counted only in the sense that the stars of a galaxy can be counted, in rough estimations that acknowledge their own inadequacy, a hive mind integrating the real-time information from so many organisms that the information flow alone represented a phenomenon, with no equivalent in anything the galaxy had previously produced. And it moved toward Baal. The home world of the Blood Angels, that sunburned desert world where the red-armored warriors of one of the Imperium's most storied Space Marine chapters drew their recruits and maintained their fortress monastery. The repository of 10,000 years of the chapter's traditions and gene seed and accumulated heritage. Baal was not simply a military asset, though it was a military asset of considerable significance. Baal was the Blood Angels in the institutional and historical sense, the place that had produced them and that continued to define them, the world that gave the gene seed its particular characteristics, and the chapter its particular relationship to the desert and the sky and the specific quality of survival that the harsh environment of Baal selected. Lord Commander Dante understood what was coming better than perhaps anyone else in the Imperium, because Dante was old enough to have personal experience of the previous Hive Fleet assaults, and had been studying the Tyranid threat with the particular focus that comes from understanding that the threat is real, and that preparation is the only meaningful response. He was one of the oldest active Space Marine chapter masters in the Imperium. His age measured in centuries, his experience encompassing the full arc of the Blood Angels' post-heresy history in ways that most of his contemporaries could only access through records. He called for aid. He mobilized everything the chapter and its successor chapters could bring to bear. He organized the defense of the Baal system with the comprehensive strategic intelligence of a commander who had been thinking about this specific problem for a very long time. The Blood Angels came to Baal. The successor chapters responded to Dante's call with the urgency that the scale of the threat required. The Flesh Tearers, the Angels Vermilion, the Angels Sanguine, the Carmine Blades, and others whose gene seed traced back to Sanguinius, and whose traditions maintained the particular character that the Blood Angels' founding had established. Even the Space Wolves, no natural allies of the Blood Angels in the complicated politics of the Adeptus Astartes, deployed forces toward the campaign in recognition of the common threat. The Imperial Guard formations in the region concentrated everything they had toward the defense of the system. It was the largest single deployment of Space Marines in the post-heresy Imperium in a single theater. The largest concentration of the Emperor's finest warriors directed toward a single objective in memory. And it almost was not enough. Even that, even the full mobilization of that much force, that much capability, that much sacrifice. The battle for Baal consumed resources that would have taken decades to replenish, if they had been replenished through ordinary means. The Blood Angels and their successor chapters took losses that the Ordo Xenos estimates reduced the combined Blood Angels lineage by more than a third of its operational strength. The Imperial Guard formations deployed in the defense were largely destroyed, The orbital defenses of the Baal system were reduced to wreckage by a biological assault that replicated the pattern of Behemoth's orbital attack in its fundamental structure, while incorporating everything the hive mind had learned since Behemoth about how Imperial orbital defenses were organized and where their weaknesses lay. What saved Baal was not any military victory achieved by its defenders, though the defenders fought with a courage and a ferocity and a willingness to spend their lives in the service of the defense that is recorded in the Blood Angel's annals with the particular reverence that the chapter reserves for its finest moments. What saved Baal was the Great Rift, the catastrophic tear in real space that opened when Cadia fell and the Eye of Terror expanded and the warp flooded into real space in ways that restructured the fundamental conditions of the galaxy's metaphysical situation. The Great Rift produced, among its many and varied consequences, a phenomenon specific to the Baal system that no strategic planner had anticipated and no theological framework had predicted. Daemons came through the rift near Baal, not as an attack on the Blood Angels or on the Tyranid swarm or as the deliberate action of any specific power within the warp, simply as a consequence of the rift's opening in a region of space where the psychic conditions produced by the Tyranid swarm's presence in the shadow had created a specific vulnerability in the barrier between real space and the warp. The warp flooded into that vulnerability. The daemons followed the flood, and they encountered the Tyranid swarm. What happens when daemons encounter Tyranids is one of the most philosophically significant facts about the nature of the Tyranid threat, and it demonstrates something about the Tyranids that the Ordo Xenos has long suspected, but had not previously had such direct evidence to confirm. The Chaos Daemons attacked the Tyranids, not strategically, not as an alliance of convenience with the Blood Angels, with the instinctive, immediate hostility of organisms that recognize each other as existential threats at a level that precedes tactical calculation. The daemons fought the Tyranids the way antibodies fight an infection, the way immune systems respond to invasive organisms, not with thought but with the deep programmed response of a system that has always known what this specific threat means. And the Tyranids were, in the environment of the daemonic incursion, significantly less effective than they had been in the purely material engagement. The shadow in the warp, that all-pervasive suppression of the warp that was the Tyranids' most powerful strategic asset, became, in this specific context, something different. The suppression of the warp, the diminishment of the psychic medium that daemons depended on for their physical manifestation, damaged the daemons that had come through the rift. But it also trapped those daemons in a space where the hive mind's suppression of the warp was preventing them from returning to the warp, forcing them to continue fighting because the exit was blocked by the very thing they were fighting against. The warp and the Tyranids had always been natural enemies in the deepest possible sense. Here, briefly, catastrophically, they were demonstrating it. The swarm around Baal was consumed, not by the Blood Angels, though the Blood Angels fought throughout, not by the arriving forces of Rabut Guilliman's Indomitus Crusade, though those forces also participated, by the daemons, and by the catastrophic interaction between the warp's flooding into real space and the Tyranid's systematic suppression of the psychic medium that made the warp's physical presence possible, and by the Blood Angels who fought in the midst of all of it, with the commitment of warriors who had decided that survival was worth fighting for even in circumstances that no doctrine had prepared them for. Baal stood. Dante stood. The Blood Angels counted their dead and found that the number was one that they had not expected to survive to count, because counting it meant that they had survived to count it, and survival had not, at several points during the campaign, seemed likely. And Leviathan continued. Not everywhere, not in every tendril, not as the vast and terrible thing it had been before the demonic catastrophe around Baal had torn portions of it apart. But it continued. Bioships that had been outside the area of the worst of the demonic incursion, tendrils that had been attacking other targets during the main engagement, components of the fleet that the hive mind had split off to pursue independent objectives and that were now rejoining the broader advance after assessing the changed situation. Leviathan was reduced. But it was not destroyed. It was not finished, and the hive mind, which had now experienced something it had not encountered at Behemoth or Kraken, which had processed the information about what happened when the warp flooded into a space the shadow was suppressing and what effect that had on its organisms, was incorporating that information into whatever it would do next. Every victory carries a darker truth. The swarm was learning. It was still learning. And the main mass of Leviathan, the central concentration of what the Ordo Xenos had assessed as the largest hive fleet ever encountered, had not been defeated. It had been reduced. It was still out there, somewhere beyond the edge of accurate detection, somewhere in the dark between the stars where the shadow preceded it and the consumed worlds followed in its wake, moving with whatever purpose the hive mind had set for it after the reassessment that Baal's outcome had required. It is still out there. That is not speculation. That is the most recent assessment in the Ordo Xenos archives, marked with the date of its compilation and the confidence interval of its conclusions, sealed behind the same protections that seal all documents in those archives that deal with information the Ordo has determined is too operationally damaging to distribute widely. Leviathan is still out there, growing, consuming, adapting, continuing to do what the hive mind has always done and will continue to do until something prevents it. The question of what could prevent something of this scale is the question that the best minds the Ordo Xenos has ever produced have been failing to answer for decades. The Tau Empire's encounter with the Tyranids is instructive in ways that go beyond the specific military events, because the Tau's response to the Tyranid threat reveals something about the nature of the challenge that the Imperium's response, constrained by 10,000 years of institutional paranoia and the particular blindnesses of faith-based military doctrine, tends to obscure. The Tau are a young species by galactic standards. Their empire, built around the principle of collective purpose expressed through the philosophy they call the greater good, has been expanding for only a few thousand years, which places them very near the infant end of the spectrum of civilizations that the galaxy contains. They are technologically sophisticated, their weapons and their methods of war reflecting a commitment to innovation and adaptation that their brief history has not yet had time to calcify into unexamined tradition. When the Tyranids first appeared in regions that bordered Tau space, the Tau response was, initially and characteristically, to attempt understanding, not negotiation. Exactly. The Tau had encountered enough alien species to understand that negotiation required a counterpart capable of negotiating, and the information their initial contact missions gathered was sufficient to establish that the Tyranids were not that. But analysis, systematic, rigorous analysis of what the Tyranids were, how they operated, what their tactical patterns were, and what countermeasures might be effective against them, The Tau brought to the study of the Tyranid threat the same methodical empiricism they brought to everything, accumulating data and developing doctrines and testing them against the actual behavior of the organisms they were studying, adjusting the doctrines based on what the testing revealed. Hive Fleet Gorgon, the Tyranid fleet that struck deep into Tau space in 999 of the 41st millennium, encountered an enemy that had prepared for it in ways that no previous opponent had fully managed. The Tau had developed weapons and tactics specifically calibrated to the Tyranid threat as they understood it. They had identified the synapse network and developed doctrines for targeting synapse creatures to disrupt local coordination. They had developed crowd control weapons effective against massed smaller organisms. They had built defensive installations that took account of the Tyranid's ability to approach from multiple vectors simultaneously, and that were designed to create overlapping fields of fire that made concentration of the swarm in any specific area costly. They fought intelligently and effectively, and gave ground only when giving ground was tactically preferable to holding it and losing more than the ground was worth. And the hive mind adapted. This is the thing that the Tau's sophisticated preparation could not overcome. Not because their preparation was inadequate, it was the best any species had produced by that point in the known history of Tyranid contact. But the hive mind processed the Tau's tactics with the same real-time thoroughness it had processed every other set of tactics it had encountered, identified the specific biological capabilities and tactical preferences that made those tactics effective, and developed new bioforms and new behavioral patterns that specifically addressed what the Tau were doing. The weapons the Tau had developed to deal with massed smaller organisms became less effective when the hive mind stopped sending massed smaller organisms against the positions that had those weapons and sent different organisms instead. The synapse targeting doctrine became less effective when the hive mind distributed synapse relay more redundantly and more deeply through the assault formations, so that eliminating any individual synapse creature had less effect on the coordination of the surrounding organisms. The doctrine that had been effective in the first phase of the campaign was less effective in the second, and significantly less effective in the third, and by the fourth phase the Tau were fighting an enemy that had incorporated everything they had done and was now doing something different, something for which they did not yet have an adequate response. Gorgon consumed a significant portion of Tau space before the Imperium intervened. The intervention was not, in the first instance, motivated by concern for the Tau, with whom the Imperium had a relationship of mutual hostility that predated the Tyranid threat and had not been significantly warmed by it. The intervention was motivated by the strategic calculation that a Tyranid fleet that finished consuming the Tau Empire would be a larger and more capable threat than a Tyranid fleet that was stopped earlier, and that stopping it required forces that the Tau alone could not muster. Space Marine chapters deployed. Imperial Guard formations that had been stationed in the region were redirected. The combined force was sufficient to break Gorgon eventually at a cost that the Imperium's official records acknowledge as significant, and the Ordo Xenos's classified assessments describe as severe. What makes Gorgon significant in the overall assessment of the Tyranid threat is not the specific outcome of the campaign, which was a qualified Imperial victory with high losses. It is what the hive mind took away from the Tau encounter. Every tactical innovation the Tau had developed, every weapon system and every doctrine had been encountered analyzed, and incorporated into the hive mind's understanding of how this species fought. When the Tyranids next encounter the Tau, they will encounter them with the full benefit of everything Gorgon learned. The Tau will face organisms specifically calibrated to counter the tactics that were most effective against Gorgon. The species that prepared most thoroughly and adapted most intelligently has inadvertently contributed the most comprehensive briefing the hive mind has ever received on how to defeat them. Inquisitor Cryptman spent most of his career in the service of the Ordo Xenos studying the Tyranid threat. He was a brilliant analyst and a genuinely courageous one, willing to follow the implications of his analysis to conclusions that were uncomfortable and operationally inconvenient, and that institutional pressure consistently encouraged him to soften or suppress. He did not soften them. He did not suppress them. He documented what the evidence showed him with the clinical precision of a scientist operating in conditions of existential emergency. And the documents he produced represent the most comprehensive and most honest assessment of the Tyranid threat that the Imperium has ever compiled. His most controversial action was the Cryptman line, a tactic that bears his name and that the Inquisition's internal review process concluded was both tactically sound and ethically indefensible, which is the kind of conclusion that the Inquisition tends to produce when it is asked to evaluate actions that prioritize strategic necessity over moral consistency. What Cryptman did was direct the extermination of the human population of a large number of worlds in the path of Hive Fleet Leviathan's advance. Not evacuation. Extermination. The elimination of those populations before the Tyranids arrive, so that the Tyranids would arrive to find no biomass available, and would consequently be less capable of replacing their losses with newly consumed resources. The populations of those worlds numbered in the billions. The killing of them was accomplished through the same weapons of mass destruction that the Imperium kept in reserve for exactly the kind of extreme strategic necessity that the Inquisition was authorized to identify. Cryptman identified it. The worlds were sterilized. Leviathan arrived to find them empty. The tactic worked in the specific, narrow sense that the Tyranid advance through that region of space was slowed by the absence of the biomass that the campaign's authors had expected to be available. The hive mind's consumption in those systems produced less return than projected, which meant fewer replacement organisms and more sustainable losses as the campaign continued. Leviathan was marginally weakened by the implementation of the Cryptman line. Marginally, Cryptman was censured and ultimately excommunicated from the Inquisition for his actions. Not because the tactic had failed, which it had not entirely, but because the precedent it established and the moral framework it required were incompatible with the Imperium's fundamental function, which was the protection of humanity. Killing billions of humans to marginally impede the advance of a hive fleet was not, the Inquisition determined after extensive deliberation, a sustainable model for the defense of the species. Even if it worked, even if it was the most effective tactic available, even if the alternative was the consumption of those billions by the Tyranids. Because what was being protected, if not the humans that the defense was supposed to protect? Cryptman spent the remainder of his career operating outside the official structures of the Inquisition, pursuing his analysis of the Tyranid threat with the resources available to a disgraced but technically still living former Inquisitor. He never stopped working. He never came to believe that the threat was overstated. He produced more analyses, more assessments, more documents that arrived in the Ordo Xenos archives through channels that were unofficial enough to maintain plausible deniability, but that the Ordo archived anyway because the contents were too valuable to discard regardless of the status of their author. The question that Cryptman kept returning to, the question that appears in some form in almost every document he produced after his excommunication, was the question of origin. Not in the evolutionary sense, not in the biological sense, though both of those questions were relevant. The question of motivation, in the sense in which motivation can be attributed to a biological system that does not experience motivation in any way that a conscious being would recognize. Why are they here? Not what do they want, because the Tyranids want nothing that can be articulated as a want. But what drew them to this galaxy? What directed the swarm from wherever it originated toward the Milky Way, rather than toward any of the other galaxies that existed in the intergalactic void? The Astronomicon was one answer that the analysis produced, and that the Ordo Xenos took seriously. The Emperor's psychic beacon, that vast and powerful signal that illuminated the Imperium for navigational purposes across thousands of light years, was detectable from outside the galaxy, detectable by any sufficiently sensitive psychic apparatus. And the hive mind's psychic apparatus had capabilities whose limits had not been established. The Astronomicon, burning brightly in the psychic dimension that the Tyranids navigated through in whatever way they navigated through it, might have functioned as exactly the kind of signal that a galaxy-spanning hunger would follow toward a new food source. The Imperium, in trying to guide its ships through the void, might have guided its greatest threat toward itself. But there was another answer, one that Cryptman mentioned in a document marked for destruction that survived its marking through the carelessness of the archivist assigned to destroy it. The other answer was that the Tyranids were not simply drawn to the galaxy. The Tyranids were fleeing something. The evidence was indirect and inferential, and the confidence interval was low. But the pattern of the Hive Fleet's approach, the specific characteristics of the course corrections that could be reconstructed from the earliest contact data, suggested movement that was not purely toward a food source, but also partly away from something else. Something in the intergalactic void, something vast enough and threatening enough that an extragalactic hunger of the Tyranid's scale and capability had chosen to move toward a galaxy full of defenders, rather than remain in whatever it was moving away from. What could threaten the Tyranids? What could exist in the intergalactic void, between the galaxies, in the darkness that no civilization in the Milky Way has ever explored or described, that the galaxy's greatest predator would choose to flee from? The document does not speculate beyond the statement of the possibility. Cryptman's scientific discipline, maintained even in the unauthorized documents of his excommunicated career, would not permit him to speculate beyond what the evidence supported. The evidence supported the possibility. It did not characterize what the possibility implied. The Octarian War is what the conflict between the Tyranids and the Orcs in the galactic east has been named in the Ordo Xenos' designation system. It began when Tyranid splinter fleets from Kraken encountered Orc wars, moving through the same regions of space, and the two species, each of which operated on biological imperatives that did not include the option of simply ignoring large concentrations of potential conflict, engaged each other with the enthusiastic violence that both were naturally inclined toward. The engagement escalated, as engagements between Orcs and anything tend to escalate, into a sustained and galaxy-scale conflict that has been ongoing for decades and that shows no signs of resolution. The outcome of the Octarian War, in strategic terms, is one of the most ambiguous questions in the Ordo Xenos's current assessment portfolio. On one hand, the Orc-War-Ars and the Tyranid splinter fleets are destroying each other, killing organisms and consuming resources that might otherwise have been directed at Imperial targets. On the other hand, the Tyranids are learning. Every engagement with the Orcs teaches the hive mind something about Orc biology, Orc tactics, Orc weapons, and Orc organizational patterns that the hive mind did not know before. The Orcs, being Orcs, are not learning in any comparable systematic way, because the Orcs' relationship to learning is more intuitive and less analytical than the hive mind's relationship to the same process. The Tyranids are getting better at fighting Orcs. The Orcs are getting more excited about fighting Tyranids, which is an improvement of a kind, but not the kind that leads to different strategic outcomes. The Octarian War may eventually produce a hive mind that knows more about Orc physiology and tactics than the Orcs know about themselves. Facing an Orc population that is somewhat reduced from its pre-war peak, but whose fundamental reproductive capacity and enthusiasm for violence are entirely unaffected. The other Hive Fleets, Hive Fleet Hydra, Hive Fleet Jormungandr, the smaller designated fleets and the undesignated tendrils and the splinter fleets that broke off from the major ones, and have been pursuing their individual campaigns through various regions of the galaxy since the engagements that scattered them. They are all out there. Some are tracked. Some are only periodically detected. Some have vanished entirely from the Ordo Xenos's monitoring. Not because they have been destroyed, but because they have moved into regions where the monitoring assets do not reach. Or because their signature has changed in ways that the monitoring assets were not calibrated to detect. Or because the hive mind has learned enough about the monitoring systems to route the affected tendrils around them. Hive Fleet Hydra is the most disturbing of the specifically designated secondary fleets, because its documented behavior includes the consumption of other Tyranid organisms, the absorption of splinter fleets that had lost coherence with the main hive mind's network into the biological material that Hydra then used to reinforce its own mass. The swarm can consume itself in the service of concentration and efficiency. The hive mind does not treat the death of organisms in internecine combat as meaningful loss. It treats the biological material of those organisms as recoverable resource. The concept of friendly fire as a constraint on military action has no application to an entity for which no distinction between friendly and enemy ultimately survives the logic of pure resource management. And through all of this, through every campaign and every battle and every consumed world and every genestial occult, spreading its influence through the communities of unsuspecting humans on worlds that have not yet been targeted, but that the fleet is moving toward, the philosophical horror of what the Tyranids represent deepens. Not because the individual horrors accumulate into something worse, though they do, but because the implications of the Tyranid's existence force every other question about the galaxy's future into a different frame. Consider what a Tyranid victory would actually mean. Not a Tyranid victory over a specific world or a specific campaign. The hypothetical complete victory, the outcome in which the Tyranids consume everything in the galaxy that is worth consuming. Every living thing, every sentience, every ecosystem, every biosphere, every population that has spent its existence contributing to the galaxy's biological and psychic richness, all consumed, all processed into biomass and carried away into whatever biological storage the Hive Fleet uses until it needs more. What remains after this process is a galaxy stripped to rock and void, every world as lifeless as the consumed worlds the Ordo Xenos has surveyed, every star still burning but illuminating nothing of significance. And the warp goes silent, because the warp is sustained by consciousness. The Chaos Gods, those vast entities whose influence on the galaxy the traitor legions serve and that the Imperial Creed defines as the ultimate spiritual threat to humanity's soul, are made from the psychic emanations of conscious beings. They are the collective output of rage and ambition and despair and desire, distilled into entities of enormous power by the accumulated contribution of billions of minds over millions of years of evolution. Remove those minds, consume every conscious being in the galaxy, and the fuel supply for the warp's great powers is gone. Not in the short term. Not immediately. The accumulated psychic energy of 10 billion years of conscious life would not dissipate overnight. But over time, the warp would cool. The Chaos Gods would diminish, starved of the ongoing contribution that sustains them, growing quieter and less capable as the source of their power was eliminated. Eventually they would not be gone exactly, but they would be something that nothing remained to fear them. This is why the daemons fight the Tyranids. Not from strategic calculation, not from an alliance with the galaxy's biological life against the biological predator that threatens it. From self-preservation. If self-preservation is a concept that applies to entities whose continuity depends on the psychic output of the beings the Tyranids consume, chaos is threatened by the Tyranids in the most fundamental possible way. Because a Tyranid victory eliminates the conditions that make chaos possible. And so the daemons fight. Not consistently, not everywhere, not with the organized coherence of a military alliance, because chaos does not produce organized coherence. But instinctively, from the deepest layer of because the Tyranids represent not merely the death of individual beings, but the death of the thing that the daemons are made of. This is one of the most significant facts about the galaxy's situation that the Ordo Xenos has ever recorded, and that has received the least public attention. Because the implications of it are complicated in ways that the Imperium's religious and political institutions are not well positioned to handle. The fact that chaos and the Tyranids are natural enemies does not make chaos the Imperium. The enemy of your enemy is not your friend when your enemy's enemy would consume you just as readily as your enemy would, simply for different reasons and on a different schedule. But the fact does suggest that the galaxy's metaphysical architecture, the relationship between consciousness and the warp and the entities that the warp sustains, is more directly threatened by the Tyranids than by any other force, including chaos itself, in the sense that a chaos victory would leave the galaxy damaged, and the warp dominant but still biological, still teeming, still producing the psychic fuel that keeps everything going. A Tyranid victory ends everything, for everyone, including the Chaos Gods. The Eldar have known this. The Eldar mythological tradition contains references to the Great Devourer that predate human spaceflight by thousands of years, which means the Eldar encountered the Tyranids or their advanced organisms before humanity had developed the technology to leave its home system. The Eldar's Farseers, those psychic specialists whose ability to perceive the currents of the future was the most sophisticated in the galaxy, had seen the coming of the Tyranids in their prescient visions, and had understood its implications long before any other species was capable of the same understanding. They had not shared this knowledge widely, for reasons that the Eldar's relationship to knowledge and disclosure make legible if not entirely forgivable. They had prepared, in as much as preparations for something of this scale could be meaningful. They had done what they could to slow the advance in systems adjacent to their space, without committing their dwindling population to direct engagement at a scale they could not sustain. They had watched Earndon fall, and understood it as a demonstration of the thing they had always. The Necrons have their own relationship to the Tyranid threat that the Ordo Xenos has been able to piece together only partially, and that remains one of the more significant open questions in the classified threat assessment portfolio. The Necrons are ancient enough to have been present in the galaxy before the events that created the Chaos Gods. Ancient enough to have experienced whatever the galaxy was before the psychic dimension achieved its current turbulent form. It is possible, and the Ordo Xenos considers it likely based on fragmentary evidence from Necron interactions with Tyranid forces, that the Necrons have encountered the Tyranids before. Not in the current invasion, before perhaps in the long galactic history that preceded the rise of the younger races. Perhaps in whatever the war in Heaven's aftermath looked like when the galaxy was settling into the configuration that the younger races inherited. What the Necrons know about the Tyranids that they have not shared with anyone, and what their strategic assessment of the current invasion looks like from inside their long and alien perspective, is unknown. What is known is that Necron forces have engaged Tyranid forces in several documented cases, that the engagements were fierce, and that the Necrons' approach to those engagements demonstrated an understanding of Tyranid tactical patterns that suggested prior familiarity rather than real-time adaptation. The galaxy is not united against the Tyranids. It is not even close to united. The Imperium fights for its survival with one set of weapons and doctrines, while simultaneously fighting the Chaos Space Marines with another set, and the Orcs with a third, and the Eldar with a fourth, and the Tau with a fifth. The resources that might have been concentrated against the existential threat of the Hive Fleets are dispersed across a dozen other conflicts, each of which has its own urgency and its own institutional advocates and its own history of sacrifice that makes it difficult to deprioritize in favor of something that, however existentially threatening it might be in the long term, is not actively burning a planet under your immediate administrative authority at this particular moment. The Imperium fights the Tyranids with whatever can be spared, which is never enough. And it calls that defense. The question that Cryptman kept asking, the one that his excommunication did not resolve because excommunication does not resolve questions, only careers, was a simple one. The question was whether what has arrived in the galaxy so far was all of it, whether Behemoth and Kraken and Leviathan and Gorgon and all the named and unnamed tendrils and the splinter fleets scattered across the void and the ongoing assaults whose details are being compiled in the Ordo Xenos archives right now, all of it, taken together, represented the Tyranid threat in its entirety. Whether if every one of those fleets were destroyed tomorrow, if every bioship were killed and every spore pod dissolved and every genestealer cult purged and every scrap of Tyranid biomass were eliminated from the galaxy, whether the threat would then be over. The analysis said no. The analysis said that what the galaxy had encountered was not the main fleet. The analysis said that the three great Hive Fleets, the ones whose names appear in every strategic briefing and whose histories fill entire volumes in the Ordo Xenos archive, were tendrils. The first tendrils, the advanced scouts of something whose main mass remained outside the galaxy, still approaching, still traveling through the intergalactic void that no sensor array the Imperium possessed was capable of monitoring effectively. coming toward the Milky Way with the same slow, patient, inexorable certainty that the first bioships brought to the Tyran system when Magos Varnak watched the darkness begin to move across his sky. If this analysis is correct, and the Ordo Xenos considers it more likely to be correct than not, then what the galaxy has experienced so far is the preview. The introduction. The opening movement of something that has not yet revealed its full scale. And every world consumed, and every organism evolved, and every piece of tactical information incorporated into the hive mind's understanding of the galaxy's defenses is preparation for what comes after. The hive mind does not hurry. The main mass does not need to hurry. It will arrive when the tendrils have done sufficient work, when the galaxy's defenses have been sufficiently studied, and its biomass inventory sufficiently assessed, when the preparation that the advance has been conducting for decades has reached the point where the arrival of the main fleet is optimally timed to produce the most efficient possible consumption. The Ordo Xenos does not know when this will be. The range of estimates in the classified assessment spans from already too late to centuries from now, which is not a confidence interval that supports strategic planning in any useful sense. What the assessment does say, with more confidence than most of its conclusions achieve, is that the time between now and whatever comes next is fine, that the pause, if there is a pause, is not peace but preparation, and that the preparation is not being done by the defenders. The Tyranids are not going away. They have no home to return to. They did not come from the galaxy, which means they have no attachment to any part of it that would draw them back to a fixed position if circumstances elsewhere became temporarily unfavorable. They came from outside. From the dark between the stars that no civilization in the galaxy has ever adequately explored, and they will continue coming until they have consumed what they came for, or until the galaxy produces something capable of stopping them. The Imperium has not stopped them. It has held some worlds and lost others, and called the held ones victories. It has studied the threat with extraordinary sophistication and produced analyses of extraordinary quality, and implemented the conclusions of those analyses with whatever resources the competing demands on those resources left available, which was never enough. Every world the Tyranids consume adds to the fleet. Every world the Tyranids consume teaches the hive mind more about how the galaxy defends itself. Every organism that dies fighting the swarm carries information about what killed it back through its connection to the hive mind in its dying moment. Every tactic that works carries in its own working the mechanism by which the next tactic will need to be different. Because the working tactic is the thing the hive mind studies to develop. The war against the Tyranids, as Kripman wrote in that prefatory line that nobody was supposed to read, is not a war in the sense that human military tradition understands war. It is something being done to the galaxy. And the galaxy's defenders are not opponents in a war so much as data points in a study whose ultimate subject is how the galaxy can most efficiently be consumed. The Tyranids did not come to rule mankind. They came to eat the stars clean. And they are still coming. Consider what it means to fight the Tyranids. Not in the abstract strategic sense, not in the Ordo Xenos assessments and the chapter tactical briefings and the regimental deployment orders, but at the level where the fighting actually happens, where the individual is and the decision is whether to hold or to run, and the decision that gets made is to hold. Consider the experience of the soldier, the space marine, the guardsman who climbed into a trench on a world under siege by the swarm, and looked out at what was coming and chose to aim and fire. The shadow in the warp preceded them. By the time the swarm arrived in force, the soldier in the trench had been living for days or weeks under its influence. The priests who had led prayers to the Emperor every morning could not connect to whatever psychic dimension those prayers were supposed to reach. The quiet confidence that the Emperor's protection provided. The deep and often unexamined assurance that something vast and benevolent was aware of you, and would, through the intercession of all the mechanisms the Imperial faith described, extend some measure of protection toward you and toward the people in the same foxhole, was gone. Muted, replaced by a flatness, a pressing absence, that the priests themselves could not explain to their congregations in terms that provided comfort, because the priests could feel it too, and they did not have adequate language for the experience of praying into silence and receiving nothing back. Not even the silence that sometimes felt like an answer, but the silence that felt like having always been alone and having not known it until this moment. The astropaths, those psychers whose role was to maintain communication with the wider Imperium through the psychic medium that the shadow had suppressed, experienced something worse. Not simply the absence of connection, but the active experience of trying to reach and finding nothing, of reaching for the Astronomicon whose light guided them, and encountering instead the weight of the shadow pressing against that reach. The sensation that every psyker who has described their experience in the shadow has struggled to articulate, but that most of them describe in terms of drowning, of being in deep water with the surface visible but receding. The light of the Astronomicon there but above you, and the shadow pulling you down. Not actively, not maliciously, just through the passive weight of its presence, which was enormous. And then the swarm. After the shadow, after the silence, after the prayers that went nowhere, and the communications that dissolved before they could form, after all of that preparation, the swarm arrived. And it was not what fear had imagined, because what fear had imagined was something definite, something with a shape and a face and a focus, something that wanted something and could be reasoned with or outmaneuvered or negotiated around, even if reasoning and negotiation were not currently viable. Fear imagined an enemy. What arrived was not an enemy in the way that fear had imagined enemies. What arrived was the swarm, which is a word that is also inadequate because swarm implies defined individual organisms, and what the soldier saw was not that. Not exactly, but a movement of things that were biological and that were coming and that produced a noise that the veterans who survived described in consistent terms that suggested they were not choosing the metaphor but were simply reporting the closest approximation to a sound they had actually heard and never managed to forget. The noise the swarm made was not silence. The noise the swarm made was a layering of sounds, each one individually identifiable as the product of a specific biological mechanism. The clicking of chitin on rock and the wet sound of organisms moving through each other's company, and the distant screaming of something being processed at the edge of the advance. And underneath it all the subsonic vibration that the largest organisms produced, simply by moving. A ground-conducted frequency that you felt in your teeth before you heard it in your ears. The noise was information. Your body processed it, and your body's conclusion, the one it communicated through the specific hormone cascade that evolution had designed for the communication of exactly this kind of situation, was that what was coming was too many and moving too fast, and would be here soon. The good soldiers held. That is the record of most engagements. Not all, but most. The Space Marines held because that is what Space Marines do, because the training and the conditioning and the gene seed and the particular psychology that the implantation process produced were all specifically designed to produce beings capable of holding when holding was the only option and the cost of holding was the life. They held with the particular quality of courage that is not the absence of fear, but the decision to be useful in the presence of it. And they gave the ground that had to be given, and they held the ground that could be held, and they tried to keep enough of both those things going simultaneously to matter. The ordinary soldiers, the Imperial Guard with their standard-issue weapons and their human bodies and their faith in the Emperor, and their faith in the Space Marines who fought alongside them, and their faith in each other, which was probably the most immediate and the most operational of those three faiths in the crisis, held, too, mostly, not always. The Tyranid assault was designed through however many millions of years of evolutionary refinement and hive mind biological engineering had produced it, to be the specific kind of thing that human beings were most poorly equipped to resist. The scale, the noise, the absence of faces, of the specific biological signals that human social cognition used to assess intent and predict behavior, because the Tyranids did not have faces in any sense that human cognition was designed to read. And the shadow, always the shadow, that suppressed the connection to everything the soldiers had been told existed to protect them, they held anyway. This is the thing about the defense of every world the Tyranids have attacked that has been defended, the thing that the strategic assessments tend to get to eventually, but that the tactical accounts convey more directly. The defenders held not because they were certain of success, but because holding was the thing that needed to be done, and they were the ones there. And so the guardsmen in their trenches, and the Space Marines at the breach points, and the orbital crews on the platforms that the bioships were destroying one by one, they held with the specific stubbornness of beings who have accepted that the situation is bad, and have decided that bad is not the same as impossible, and that impossible is not the same as not worth trying. And in the worlds where they succeeded, which were fewer than the ones where they did not, the outcome was worth the cost. The world lived. People survived. The swarm was beaten back. The Tyranids moved on to other targets. The worlds where they did not succeed produced the other kind of record. The ones in the Ordo Xenos archives that are not tactical assessments but testimonials. The words of the last people to transmit anything from those worlds before the shadow suppressed the communications entirely, the fragments that survived in damaged form and that the archivists reconstructed as best they could. These are the records that the inquisitors who enter the archive sometimes stop reading at a certain point, not because they are incomprehensible, because they are comprehensible, because the last thing a person transmitted from a world being consumed by the Tyranids was, more often than not, something human, something small and specific and completely ordinary, the kind of thing you say when you are saying the last thing and you have given up trying to convey the scale of what is happening, and you are just saying the thing that is true right now, in this moment, before the moment. The Ordo Xenos does not publish these. They are archived. The reason they are archived rather than destroyed is the same reason the entire archive exists. The reason that Cryptman spent his career refusing to soften or suppress his conclusions, even when the institutional pressure to do so was enormous, and came from people with the authority to make his career very difficult. Because the truth matters. Because what the truth is has consequences for what can be done about it. and what can be done about it is the only question that matters. And getting to the answer requires knowing the truth. However terrible the truth is, however much the specific quality of its horror recommends concealment, the truth is that the galaxy is being eaten. The truth is that what has arrived so far, the Hive Fleets with their designations and their campaigns and their consumed worlds and their dead, is the vanguard, the first tendrils, the advanced scouts of something whose main mass is still approaching through the intergalactic void. The truth is that the defense is heroic and insufficient, and ongoing, that every generation produces its heroes, and every hero represents a genuine and specific individual who chose to stand in the path of something that could not be reasoned with and tried to make the difference that needed to be made, and that this is admirable and necessary and entirely possibly not enough. The truth is that the Tyranids are not going away, and that the shadow is not receding, and that the worlds the hive mind has consumed since the first contact at Tyran are not coming back, and that the ones it will consume in the campaigns currently underway and the campaigns not yet begun are unlikely to come back either. And the truth is that none of this is a reason to stop. Not because hope is rational, in the strict sense of a rational assessment of probabilities, but because the alternative to fighting is not surviving, and is not even dying cleanly. The alternative to fighting is being consumed, which is different from dying in the way that the Eldar understand with their particular and ancient dread, in the way that the Ordo Xenos understands when it compiles its assessments and marks them with their highest security classifications, and places them in archives that very few people will ever read. The alternative to fighting is the world of Tyranid. The alternative to fighting is the record that Margos Varnak transmitted in fragments, the transmission ending mid-sentence, the last word unrecovered, the last moment of what had been a community of researchers doing careful and methodical work, becoming the last moment of anything on that world at all. The soldiers in their trenches understood this, or some version of it. They did not have the strategic context, most of them. They did not have the Ordo Xenos assessments, or the long view on the scale of the threat, or the analysis of what the hive mind was learning from each engagement. They had the trench, and the weapons, and the people beside them, and the noise of what was coming, and the absence of the Emperor's light in the shadow's suppression, and the decision about whether to hold or to run. And they held. Most of them held, because that is what people do when the alternative is everything stopping. When holding is the only thing that keeps the world that produced them, and the people they know, and the ordinary things that make existence worth having, from becoming the particular kind of nothing that the Tyranids leave behind. This account will end, as the Ordo Xenos reports end, with the acknowledgement that what is documented is not the last word. New campaigns begin, new worlds fall, new defenses are organized, and new tactics are developed, and new heroes emerge, and new testimonials are added to the archive by the last transmissions of the people who sent them in the moments before everything went quiet. The record accumulates, the understanding deepens, the situation continues. The Tyranids are not the only threat the galaxy faces. They are not the only reason the Imperium's institutions struggle under pressures they were not designed to sustain. They are not the only darkness in a galaxy that has always had more darkness than it could comfortably accommodate. But they are a particular darkness, a specific and unique and terrifying quality of threat that no previous enemy has represented, that no human mythology or philosophical tradition was quite equipped to prepare anyone to face. that arrived from outside the galaxy with the patient, indifferent biological certainty of a process that had always been going to happen and that was happening now. The hive mind does not sleep. The bioships do not anchor in harbor waiting for orders. The spore pods do not sit in storage awaiting deployment. The swarm does not pause to mourn its dead, or debate its strategy, or consider whether the war is worth continuing. The swarm continues, because continuing is what the swarm does, and what the swarm does is the only thing the swarm has ever done, and the swarm will be doing it when the last archives of the Ordo Xenos are consumed, and the last Inquisitor who might have read them is gone, and there is nothing left to read them, because there is nothing left at all. Unless the galaxy produces something capable of stopping it. Unless the defenders whose names fill the tactical records and the testimonials and the casualty lists of every engagement since Tyran produce. In the aggregate of their heroism and their intelligence and their willingness to hold when holding is the only option. Something sufficient to the scale of what they are facing. Unless the hive mind, for all its learning and adaptation and biological sophistication, encounters something it cannot adapt to, something that operates outside the frameworks it has developed over its long study of the galaxy's defenses, something that changes the mathematics of the war in a way that the current mathematics does not make available. This is the hope. It is not a comfortable hope or a certain hope or a hope that the evidence gives any particular reason to be confident in. It is simply the alternative to the other outcome, the one that the Ordo Xenos assessments describe in the clinical language of professionals who have committed to honesty even when honesty produces conclusions that are not encouraging. The alternative to the other outcome is worth fighting for. Every soldier who held their trench, and every space marine who stood at the breach, and every guardsman who aimed and fired into the swarm that was too many to stop, and every orbital crew who kept the platforms operational until the last moment before they failed was fighting for the alternative, was choosing to fight for it, was making the specific individual decision that the alternative was worth their life. The darkness in the sky moves. This is the thing Varnak transmitted at the end, or close to it, the phrase that appears in the reconstructed fragments of his last communication, and that the Ordo Xenos has placed in the prefatory matter of the comprehensive Tyranid threat assessment as a reminder to everyone who reads it of where the documentation started. The darkness in the sky moves. And then there was nothing. Between that nothing and the next nothing stands everything the galaxy has left. Every fighter, every defender, every world that has not yet been targeted, and every one that has been targeted and held, and every one that has been targeted and is being held. Right now by people whose names and faces and specific individual qualities of courage and capability the strategic assessments do not record, but that the people fighting alongside them know. Between those two nothings, the one that was Tyran and the one that would be everything if the swarm completes its work, stands the defense. Imperfect and insufficient and ongoing and human, in the broadest sense of that word. In the sense that includes every species that has chosen to face the swarm, rather than be consumed by it, in the sense that includes the Eldar Ghost Warriors fighting with the souls of their dead and the Tau Fire Warriors adjusting their tactics in real time to counter the adaptation that they know is coming, and the Space Marines in their ancient armor maintaining the oath of moment even when. The math of the engagement does not favor the oath being kept. It stands. So far it stands. The darkness is moving, the swarm is learning, the main mass is coming, and the defense stands. For now. The word carries all the weight it needs to carry, and it carries it honestly, which is the only way the Ordo Xenos knows how to carry anything. For now, the worlds that have been defended are still there. The people who held their trenches are still there. The Ultramarines who rebuilt after Macragge are still there. The Blood Angels who counted their dead after Baal and found themselves counting are still there. The record continues. The archive accumulates, the darkness moves, and the light is still burning. And the question of which outlasts the other is the most important question in the galaxy, and nobody who is honestly looking at the evidence has an answer they can give with confidence, and so the defense continues, because continuing is all that is left, and what is left is worth continuing for. The worst thing in Warhammer 40,000 is already coming. It has been coming for longer than most of the civilizations it is coming for have existed. It is coming still. And the galaxy, fractured and wounded and divided and fighting a dozen other wars simultaneously, is choosing, in the only way available to things that are choosing to continue, to remain. To aim at what is coming and fire and hold the line for one more moment and then another, in the hope that the moments accumulate into something sufficient, in the knowledge that they might not, in the will that they will anyway. That is the defense of the galaxy against the Tyranid Hive Fleets. That is the story of what is coming. That is the truth the Sorrow Archive keeps. And the truth the Ordo Xenos' assessments document, and the truth that every soldier in every trench on every world the Swarm has ever targeted has understood in the specific and personal way that you understand a truth when it is standing in front of you and you are deciding what to do about it. The darkness in the sky moves, and some things so far have moved back. The record continues. The doom of Malantai. The name is given in the Eldar tradition to an organism that the Ordo Xenos has catalogued under a different designation. A zoanthrope of exceptional psychic capability that accompanied Hive Fleet Naga in its assault on the Eldar craft world of Malantai, and that demonstrated, in the course of that assault, a capability no previous Tyranid organism had been documented to possess. The Doom did not fight in the conventional Tyranid manner. It did not charge defensive positions or tear through fortifications with biological weapons, or direct lesser organisms through its synapse connection. It drifted through the craft world's interior, carried by a kinetic field that its psychic power, and it ate the infinity circuit. Not physically, not in the sense of consuming the physical substrate of the circuit, which was distributed through the craft world's structure and was not accessible to physical consumption in any straightforward way. It drained the psychic energy that the infinity circuit contained. The souls that the Eldar dead had placed in the circuit, those millions of preserved personalities who had been living their diminished, continued existence in the network, were drawn out of it and into the Doom, their psychic energy consumed by the organism the way that the digestion pools consumed organic matter, efficiently and completely and without any awareness of the specific quality of what was being consumed. The dead of Malantai were not merely, they were drained dry. Their psychic substance extracted and incorporated into the Doom's own biological functioning. Their centuries of accumulated identity reduced to fuel for something that had no concept of identity. Malantai did not survive the assault. The craft world was destroyed, its structure collapsed, its living population killed, its infinity circuit emptied by the Doom and its physical substrate broken by the forces that followed. There are no survivors of Malantai to provide testimony about what the experience of watching the circuit drain was like, about what it felt like for the living Eldar to sense the psychic emanations of their ancestors simply stopping in the way that a transmission stops when the source is destroyed. There are only the accounts of Eldar from other craft worlds who monitored what they could of the assault from a distance, and who have described what they perceived as the most horrific thing they had ever experienced, worse than their direct combat losses, worse than the destruction of the craft world itself. The specific experience of feeling the dead of Malantai going quiet. This tells us something important about the Tyranid threat's relationship to the psychic dimension that goes beyond the tactical fact of the shadow in the warp. The hive mind is not simply indifferent to psychic energy, it is capable of consuming psychic energy. The zoanthrope organisms that appear in most major Tyranid assaults are powerful psychic entities in their own right, capable of generating and directing psychic forces that compare favorably with the capabilities of human psykers, and in some documented cases exceed them. Their biological form reflects the biological cost of this capability, their bodies reduced to almost vestigial proportions while their skulls have expanded to accommodate the neural architecture that psychic power requires, supported by kinetic fields because the rest of the organism is too underdeveloped to bear the skull's weight under standard gravitational conditions. They are specialist organisms deployed for specific, and those purposes include the neutralization of enemy psychic assets. The zoanthrope does not simply fight psykers by killing them. Though it can do, it fights psykers by being a better user of the psychic medium than most of its opponents. By projecting warp energy in directed forms that can destroy conventional defenses through the same mechanisms that conventional weapons use but without the logistical requirements. By existing as an organism that the hive mind can deploy without supply lines or ammunition constraints because the organism's weapon is biological and self-sustaining. And in the specific case of the doom of Malantai, it demonstrated that the hive mind's approach to psychic energy was not merely defensive or offensive, but also predatory in the most literal sense. Psychic energy is, in some form that the Ordo Xenos does not fully understand, a resource. The hive mind consumes resource, whether the consumption of psychic energy from the infinity circuit represented the hive mind's deliberate identification of a new resource type, or was an emergent behavior from an organism whose psychic consumption capability happened to be applicable to that target, is unclear. What is clear is that the capability exists. What is clear is that the hive mind knows it exists. Every Eldar craft world has an infinity circuit. They are all potential targets for what was done to Malantai. The Eldar understand this. It is one of the reasons the Eldar's commitment to fighting the Tyranids carries a different quality of urgency than most other species' commitment. The specific urgency of beings who understand that the thing threatening them threatens not merely their lives, but the continued existence of everyone they have ever known and loved and mourned and preserved. The Eldar craft world tradition was built, at least in part, around the preservation of the dead in a form that maintained something of what they had been. The Tyranids threatened to make that preservation not merely impossible for future deaths, but retroactively meaningless for the deaths that have already been. An Eldar who dies with their soul preserved in a craft world circuit that is subsequently consumed has not simply died. They have been consumed. The distinction matters enormously in Eldar theology, and in the ordinary way that any people might care about what happens to those they have lost. The bioships themselves, the organisms that form the body of the fleet rather than the ground assault force, deserve more attention than strategic accounts of the war tend to give them. They are not merely transport vessels or weapons platforms. They are organisms in the full biological sense, self-sustaining living creatures of a scale that exceeds most things that exist in the galaxy. The largest documented bioships are classified by Imperial tactical systems in the same size category as battleship-class vessels. But the comparison between a manufactured warship and a bioship of equivalent mass is so misleading that maintaining it produces analytical errors. A manufactured warship is designed to perform specific functions and is limited to those functions. A bioship has evolved to perform its role in the fleet's ecology and adapts continuously to perform that role more. A manufactured warship sustains damage and loses capability proportionally. A bioship sustains damage and repairs it through the same biological processes that built it in the first place, at rates that depend on available biological resources, and that can be in environments where those resources are available faster than the damage is being inflicted. The weaponry the bioships carry is biological in a way that no human weapons system replicates. They project biological acids, spores, and organic compounds that have corrosive or toxic effects on manufactured ship hulls and on the biological components of their crews. They deploy launch organs that release spore pods and boarding organisms into the space around enemy vessels. They project what the Adeptus Mechanicus has characterized as bioplasma, a projected biological energy of a kind that the machine cult's entire tradition of weapons analysis has not been able to adequately categorize, because it does not fit any of the physical frameworks that the tradition was developed to analyze. It works. Whatever the mechanism, it works, in the sense that it damages manufactured ships in ways that reduce their combat effectiveness. The mechanism of its working is a question that remains open. The fleet as a whole is also a biological system, a superorganism of sorts, with the individual ships filling ecological roles within the fleets functioning the way that individual organisms fill ecological roles within a biological community. Some ships are primarily consumptive, focused on the harvest and processing of biomass from planetary surfaces. Some are primarily military, focused on the neutralization of enemy vessels and orbital defenses. Some are primarily reproductive, carrying the biological production capacity of the Norn queens, and focused on the generation of new organisms to replace losses. And some are primarily communicative, serving as relays for the hive mind's psychic network, extending the range and the clarity of the connection that coordinates everything the fleet does. The loss of any category of ship affects the others in ways that a purely military analysis, which treats ships as weapons platforms rather than as biological entities with ecological relationships to each other, tends to miss. The Adeptus Mechanicus has studied Tyranid bioships extensively, both through remote analysis and in the few cases where the material of destroyed bioships has been recovered before the fleet retrieved it for its own consumption processes. What the analysis has revealed is biology of a sophistication that the Mechanicus's own tradition of biological study, which is not the tradition's strongest area, has been inadequate to fully characterize. The specific mechanisms by which the bioships sustain themselves in the void, the biological analogues of the life support systems that manufactured ships require, the nature of the psychic connections that link individual ships to the fleet's overall network, the way that damage triggers repair processes, and the biochemical mechanisms of those processes. All of these remain areas of active investigation where the investigation has produced more questions than answers. What the investigation has produced answers about is the fleet's adaptive response to combat, which is the most operationally significant thing to understand. The bioships adapt between engagements in ways that manufactured warships cannot. The biological matrix that underlies their structure is capable of reorganization, of changing the distribution of defensive biological armor, of strengthening specific systems in response to damage patterns, of modifying the output of weapon systems in response to the effectiveness the current configuration has demonstrated against the specific opponents the fleet is fighting. This happens not through deliberate engineering, not through the equivalent of a repair crew implementing modifications ordered by a design authority, but through the same biological processes that govern adaptation in all organisms, operating at the specific scale and rate that the hive mind's ability to direct biological resources makes possible. A bioship that took heavy damage to its forward hull in one engagement will show measurably different hull composition in the equivalent zone in its next engagement, if it survives to have a next engagement. The change will not be arbitrary. The change will represent an improvement, however marginal, in resilience against whatever caused the damage. This is the Tyranid adaptation mechanism in its most visible form, the form that the Ordo Xenos can actually observe and measure. The ground-level adaptation, the behavioral and tactical changes that happen in the swarm organisms from moment to moment during an engagement, is harder to observe directly because observing it requires surviving in the engagement long enough to recognize the change. And the soldiers in a position to observe it are generally occupied with the immediate problem of the organism that is trying to kill them. What the after-action reports show, however, compiled from the survivors of engagements against the same Tyranid forces across multiple battles, is consistent with what the bioship analysis shows. The organism that killed your soldiers in the second battle was not identical to the organism that tried to kill them in the first battle, and was stopped by the tactic that worked then. It was different in specific ways that addressed the tactic that worked. It had adapted. The Imperial response to this adaptive pressure has been, across the decades of the conflict, a combination of desperate tactical innovation and deeply inadequate strategic coordination. Tactical innovation because the commanders and soldiers actually fighting the Tyranids at the individual engagement level are capable and experienced, and have learned, through the costly experience of fighting the swarm, what kinds of things tend to work and what kinds of things tend to not work, and are capable of applying that learning in the next engagement. Strategic coordination inadequate, because the Imperium's institutional structures are not designed to aggregate and distribute that learning at the speed the swarm's adaptation requires. Because the information from engagement in one sector does not reach the commanders in another sector until the relevant adaptation cycle is complete, and the lesson from the first sector is no longer applicable to the updated organism that the second sector is now facing. The Tau's approach to this problem, their systematic collection and rapid distribution of tactical analysis across their forces, represented the most sophisticated attempt to match the hive mind's information distribution capabilities that any species had produced. It was better than the Imperial approach. It was still insufficient. Not because the Tau's institutions were inadequate to the task of collecting and distributing information, which they were not, but because the hive mind's distribution of information was not an institutional process, but a biological one, not dependent on communication systems or chains of command or the social structures that any institution required to function. The hive mind distributed information the way that your nervous system distributes sensation from your fingertip to your brain, instantaneously and continuously, and through mechanisms that did not require any of the organizational overhead that institutional information distribution required. The Tau's very good institutional information distribution was still slower than a nervous system. Against the hive mind, slower is the difference between adapting in time and adapting after the wave has passed. There are those in the Ordo Xenos who have argued, through the decades of frustration that the inadequacy of every defensive response has accumulated, that the proper response to the Tyranid threat is not military in the first instance but biological. That what is needed is not better weapons, or better tactics, or better information distribution, though all of those things help but something that operates at the level at which the Tyranid threat actually operates, which is the biological level, the level of organisms and adaptation, and the deep evolutionary dynamics that have produced the swarm's capabilities. That what is needed in the most extreme version of this argument is something that can out-adapt the hive mind, something that adapts on the same timescale and through the same kind of mechanism, something that the hive mind's study of the galaxy's defenses has not already encountered and incorporated and counter-adapted to. This argument has not, in the time available, produced anything The biological sciences of the Imperium are constrained by the Mechanicus's traditional suspicion of significant deviation from established forms, which is not an environment that tends to produce rapid biological innovation on the timescales the Tyranid threat operates on. The argument itself has been filed in the same section of the classified archives as the analysis of what a Tyranid victory would do to the warp, in the section whose classification markers indicate that the contents are accurate and important, and too operationally destabilizing to distribute widely. These archives are becoming very full. What the galaxy has, in the time available and in the situation as it currently stands, is the defense. The imperfect, insufficient, heroic, ongoing, necessary defense conducted by every species and every institution, and every individual that has chosen to stand against the swarm rather than be consumed by it. This is not, given the honest assessment of the evidence, clearly going to be enough. It is also not clearly going to be the honest answer to the question of whether the galaxy can survive the Tyranid threat is that the honest answer is not available, because the information needed to calculate it with confidence, the full scale of the main fleet and the hive mind's strategic intentions, and the timeline of the main fleet's arrival, and the long-term dynamics of the galaxy's defensive capability against the ongoing attrition of swarm, is not available. What is available is the present. The worlds that are holding and the worlds that have fallen, and the defenders who are fighting right now, in this moment, in the engagements that are not in any archive because they have not ended yet. Because the people who would write the after-action reports are still in the middle. They are holding their positions and firing their weapons and making the decisions that in aggregate constitute the defense that the galaxy has against the worst thing that has ever threatened it. They do not know, most of them, the full scale of what they are part of. They know the trench, and the weapons, and the people beside them, and the noise, and the choice. The darkness in the sky moves, and some things so far have moved back. And the question of whether what can move back is sufficient to the scale of what is moving is the question that the Ordo Xenos archives, and the Tyranid threat assessments, and the sealed reports and the testimonials of the last transmissions all circle around without fully answering. Because the full answer is not yet, because the people providing the answer are still out there, still fighting, still making the next decision and then the one after that. The record continues. The archive accumulates. The swarm learns. The defense holds. And the darkness, vast and patient and extragalactic and utterly indifferent to the meaning of what it consumes, continues its slow and inevitable advance toward everything the galaxy has ever been. And somewhere in the void beyond the edge of the mapped galaxy, where no sensor array reaches, and where the shadow has not yet touched anything worth touching, the main mass is patient, biological, hungry in the only way that something can be hungry, when hunger is the entire architecture of its existence, and the satisfaction of that hunger is not a state it is capable of achieving, but simply an ongoing process it is capable of continuing. Coming toward a galaxy that has been burning itself apart in internal conflicts for 10,000 years, and that is now facing the consequence of that burning in the form of defenses that are less than they might have been if those years had been spent differently. This is the full horror of the Tyranid Hive. Not any individual organism or any individual campaign or any individual world consumed and stripped to rock. The full horror is the scale, and the indifference, and the learning, and the approaching certainty that what has come so far is the beginning, and the question of whether the galaxy can be enough to face what comes after the beginning. The answer is not yet written. The record continues. The darkness moves, and the light, small and surrounded and stubborn, burns on.